So, hello everyone and welcome to this morning session. My name is Pierre Petit. I'm a social anthropologist working at the ULB, the Free University of Brussels, and I'm attached to EAST, the research center that hosts this conference, but also to the LAMC, the Laboratory for Anthropology of Contemporary Roads. And my field research is mostly carried out in Laos, in a lesser way in Vietnam, among ethnic minorities of the highlands, even if the first part of my career was devoted to Central Africa. And the main topics of my research are first the mobility of these highlanders who more and more often leave their home village to work in the major cities of the Mekong Valley, especially in the capital city Vientiane. And second, historical anthropology with the twin aim of reconstructing the past of these societies using eclectic methodologies and sources, and also with the aim to understand the way people make use of the past as a resource in the memory studies. Well, I've been involved in the crew of the GENESYs project since its start in 2016, and today I will chair this session presenting one of the main outputs of this project. This is the forthcoming special issue of the journal Civilisation, titled Public Spaces in Socialist East Asia, Interaction, Performativity, Citizenship. And this is a special issue that was co-edited by Vanessa Franville, Lisa Richaud, and myself, and it will be released, hopefully, in the very next weeks. So this session aims at giving you a first glimpse about this special issue involving 13 authors with 8 case studies and 1 introduction. I'm also the editor of the journal Civilisation, and I would like to say a few words about the journal. It's been continuously published since 1951, which makes it one of the oldest or senior journal devoted to non-European societies. It was initially created as a platform to address the rapid social changes that were taking place in the countries of the South, with a view to acknowledge the diversity and the value of cultures that were not always fully recognized as such at the time. And this explained the S of the journal Civilisation, which at the time was a political commitment, in fact, in that period where colonialism was still the norm in very large parts of the world. And this journal has been hosted by the Free University of Brussels since 1981. It underwent a major editorial reorientation in 2002 when it became a peer-reviewed journal devoted to anthropology in its relations to other human sciences. And now it's published on a yearly basis. It's centered on a specific topic, and we will come via. And please do not hesitate to address potential contributions to this journal. So let's come now to the special issue. The final title is Public Spaces in Socialist East Asia, Interaction, Performativity, and Citizenship. So as you may guess from the title, the range of topics that we address does not fully coincide with the original scope of the project GENESYs. First, we decided not to restrict contributions to papers relating to the youth. Apart from an article on youth's perception about urban issues in Hanoi, Vietnam, the contributions are not focused on a specific category of age. This decision was motivated by a desire to tap a large variety of thematic discussions on the theme of public space, defined from the start on very practical terms, as assuming accessibility to all, the visibility of the actions, events, or situations taking place in them, but also a certain type of sociability that goes beyond the minimal interactions of urban traffic described by Ulf Anertz in his seminal book Exploring the City, published long ago in 1980. A second difference of the special issue with the GENEsYs project is that we restricted the original subcontinental coverage to 3 Marxist-Leninist countries of the region. So we have 3 contributions about the People's Republic of China, 2 on Vietnam, and 2 on Laos. The 3 countries seemed a ground for a reasonable comparatism and an original cross-cutting perspective on societies that share many similarities. We thought also about including North Korea, but it's, as you know, very difficult to find people doing field work in this country. And please, if you know someone who knows about doing field work in that place of the world, please redirect him or her to the journal. He or she would be welcome. Comparing China, Vietnam, and Laos is relevant for different reasons. The 3 countries have gone through a long period of war before a revolution that installed an authoritarian regime persisting until the present. And after a period of enforced revolutionary policies involving forms of collectivization, the 3 countries opened from the 1980s onwards to forms of market economy and tourism. They opened partially to global flows and engaged on the road to development, with China being well beyond on this road, beyond Vietnam and Laos in this respect. So the 3 countries share a system of institutions devoted to social and political control, like mass organizations, and a strict supervision on what is expressed in public spaces, which are still a privileged setting for state propaganda. As appears in the contributions, this does not deprive the population from using public spaces along ways that depart from the official political lines and predictions. A recurring question of the article is, what are the modes of adherence, resistance, circumvention, or indifference in this new context, and how are these modes shaped through physical space itself? However, if public spaces encompass important political issues, the latter should not become a limit to analysis. For example, to what extent can we look at users' activities in public spaces through the lens of politics, when playfulness, sensorial, and emotional experience prevail in the analysis? Now I would like to resume with the evolution of the 3 countries since a few decades. Further changes are manifest. Motorized mobility, for instance, has become accessible to most citizens and has dramatically changed traffic practices, and this will be developed by me in a few minutes. The development of real estate projects transformed deeply the urban fabric. New forms of consumption by emerging middle classes and increasingly autonomous youths triggered the creation of new spaces to adapt to new expectations. Processes of patrimonialization have created new symbolic maps. Hybrid publics have emerged through migrations as well as domestic and international tourism. Political and police scrutiny are increasingly supported by new surveillance technologies, and the Internet has created a virtual space that duplicates and influences interactions and habits in physical spaces. Engaging with Goffman, Ulf and Hertz has highlighted the benefit of an interactionist perspective on urban spaces. But this perspective has not often been explored in concrete terms, at least, in socialist East Asia. What methodological and conceptual approaches can help to understand the specific structure of interactions in public spaces? What are the material, visual, and sonic arrangements that give public spaces an atmosphere that fosters exchanges? How do certain public places achieve the status of symbolic or even iconic sites? How do they contribute to the social production of collectives of belongings, to quote the concept originally coined by the late Mathieu Hilgers, which raises notably the issue of citizenship, which is present in the title of the special issue. Now, to come to the 8 contributions of our special issue that you can see now on the slideshow. They all, of course, provide tentative answers to these questions and authors that were presented at length in our original call for papers. And during this present session, a selection of 4 papers will be presented by their authors. I would like, however, to briefly introduce the author for contribution so that you can have a relatively complete idea of the special issue. So, for Ryan Flock, the first paper, you can see that the title is Civilizing Urban Public Space, an Analysis of Ideology and Governance Strategies. Ryan Flock discusses how the concept of kenming, which can be broadly translated as civilized behavior, has been instrumentalized by the authorities in China and participates in the control and discipline of city dwellers. Based on her research in Guangzhou, she shows how this concept is performatively used to shape a moral order, notably through propaganda posters displayed in the city to trigger an emulation towards order and respect. More than a mere representation, kenming has practical consequences, ranging from urban planning to the expulsion of street vendors from touristic spots. Tim Hawkes and Yang wrote a joint article titled Dance Machine, Performing the City in China's Public Spaces. Based on research in 2 small Guizhou cities, they investigate the square dances performed by middle-aged citizens as a vernacular production of urban modernity. They also show that these practices are in no way an expression of resistance, but are, however, quite different from the grand schemes of urban planners who are more in line with the aspiration of the Chinese middle class for civilized modernity. Marie Bello will present a paper. Now for Catherine Earle, she wrote an inspiring paper titled Stuck in Motion, Co-riding Interaction and Social Distancing in Public Space in Ho Chi Minh City. Catherine has kindly accepted to discuss the 4 papers of this session, and she will be last to take the floor. I hope that some elements of her presentation will touch also the contents of her article. Anyway, in a nutshell, her text is an exploration of the notion of public space, taking as a starting point the Saigon bus network in Ho Chi Minh City. So, how are interactions between co-riders organized in such moving public spaces? How are such interactions affected by an unexpected event, the presence in the bus of a drunkard that makes people experience an offensive odor? Our article demonstrates that the work of Irving Goffman remains a powerful source of inspiration for grasping the very notion of public space. And you see that the next text will be presented by Nguyen Van Minh. For the text of Madeleine Hikes and Sarah Turner, the title is Youth Negotiations, Navigating Public Spaces, Access and Urban Planning. This is a text based on interviews conducted among youths of varied socio-economic statuses. The 2 geographers intend to capture the opinions of the research participants to the rapid evolutions of the city of Hanoi. How do they think about the urban planning, about the problems of pollution, marginalization? They show that if the youth have no possibility to frontally confront the state's bold ideas on urban development, they are not passive and they display a set of tactics to navigate the present situation. As you see, the next 2 papers are about Laos, and they will be presented online in the next minutes. So these contributions are somehow the 4 I have presented, at least I have presented right now, are the hidden part of our panel, and I hope that this summary can give you a good idea of the whole scope of our special issue and maybe act as a teaser, so to have you read the full volume. Now we turn to the second half of those papers that will be presented in 15-minute sessions by the authors, and we begin in due time, in fact, with a paper on China by Marie Bello from the University of Lyon. So, Marie, you have the floor. So, Marie, can you take the floor, please? And also exchange your slideshow. Can you open it?
The microphone.
The microphone
Yeah.
also. We cannot hear
Okay.
you. Okay, now we hear you.
Can
That's
hear
great.
me? And
That's
do
better
I-
like this, sure.
Do you have my PPT? It's okay?
It's okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay,
And welcome.
so first, I want to thank all the organizers of this GENEsYs final conference and also the coordinators of this civilization special issue, Vanessa Franville, Pierre Petit, and Lisa Richaud. I will start with the description of. I can't put the slide. Why is it not here? So I will start with the description of a situation that I observed on fieldwork. And here you can see one of the picture of this evening. So the situation took place in a youth space in Beijing. And I'll come back after briefly on this kind of like a description of this place and the people coming there. So that night was an evening about feminism, like the title, what is feminism? There were 40 to 50 people with slightly more women than men, and people were, for most of them, young workers, skilled workers, aged 20 to 35. So on the program that evening, there were first a presentation that was made by 4 young feminist activists, and they did a presentation in 2 parts. The first one, like you can see the picture, they presented some collective action, protests and struggles made by feminist groups in China. And then they, like after this brief presentation, each of them start to make a presentation of her own personal story, including lots of personal suffering, discrimination that they suffer regarding their gender, and so on. So the first one was a woman that was an activist from a Cantonese lesbian women's rights organization. The second one initiated a group that focuses on gender equality and also works with organizations fighting against domestic violence. The third one was a member of Beijing Gay Center, the co-founder of a feminist film festival, and an activist against domestic violence. But none of all this stuff that I just said about them and the belongings to organizations that are quite militant, that are quite like political, were told during this evening. It was just like afterwards, when I tried to make some research about who was this woman, that I finally found all these elements about themselves. And both during the presentation that they made about themselves, like who they were, what was their personal stories, and after, because there were like a long debate with the audience about like personal discrimination and sufferings. So during these 2 parts, there were like a strong emotion that was in the discourses, and most of the debate was about describing experiences and personal suffering. This situation being described, I will give some like quick elements of background analysis. So these kind of emotional narratives are not without precedence in China. The expression of emotion in public, even if it was quite surprising for me, already happened in some various forms, like for example, the suku in the 1950s, which is a practice of telling of one's suffering or to pour out one business in public, or more recently, the practice of tansin, which is like speaking from the heart, talking heart to heart, which has been used as a means of dialogue between the state and the masses with the aim of gauging public opinion. But those practices were pushed by state actors mainly, which is quite different in the situation I just described. And maybe second point of background analysis, the strong interweaving in China, in today's China and in other post-socialist countries, of public and private spaces and sphere. So for example, for China, public spaces have been used for private purposes, and there is also the intervention in private spaces by the state and state agents. At the same time, the institutional structures allow the state to absorb organization, even if they are not directly developed within its remit. And the authorities can inspect and observe local initiatives depending both on the local situations as well as the broader political context. So as a result, there is some tactics that we can see regarding subjects that may be sensitive or object of control, both this tactic to be less visible from the authorities and to render discourse accessible maybe to a public that is outside the inner cycles of the social movement. That leads us to some question. How do these tactics function? How can we understand them in relation to the surveillance practices put in place by the public authorities? And finally, given this context, what should we make of the situation on the ground that I described just above, and especially regarding emotion? Quickly, the fieldwork, like the use spaces in which the situation took place, like there are open apartments that provide a dedicated venue for conferences, debates, screenings, or even just a place to hang out, most of the time for free. They are located in university districts in major Chinese cities, and people coming are most of the time young workers, graduated from university, and students that are aged between 20 and 35. So these young skilled workers are particularly subjected to different processes, like to the pressure to succeed both professionally and personally, to a set of economic gains that take precedence over the private self, following a logic that turns individuals into their own entrepreneurs, and to highly recommended self-expression. To come back to more precisely about my fieldwork on the porosity of public and private space, for an example, at the use space, the space may also offer people accommodation with the rooms of the apartment that are turned into dormitory. So there is the construction of a continuum between public and private space that depends on the individuals who come, both in terms of their personal situation and their own private space, and also in terms of whether they take on more or less prominent roles during the debates and conference. In turn, the same space may be judged as being either public or private, and people's justification for coming to the place may fall into one or the other category. For the regulation of the social space that I'll also talk about in the introductions, in the introduction, there is the attempt to incorporate or to associate private organization with state-owned institutions. And for example, for these use spaces, the Communist Youth League tried to incorporate the use spaces into its satellites organization, but that was refused by the funder of the use space. And all this in a context where limits of what can or cannot be done from a political standpoint remain still very uncertain in China, and maybe more and more. So there is at the same time the regulation of this space that is really strong, and we also need to take into account regarding this regulation and these forms of control, the subjective dimension of the actors in presence. And here come the emotion and how we can try to understand this emotion in a situation where they're really strongly put and emphasizes. So the analysis of emotion is increasingly important in social sciences. About politics, it has been considered more broadly from the 2000s. And for example, in the political work, intermediary organization can give meaning to these emotions, either to get people to act in a certain way or by using the emotion as a device to raise awareness. Conclusion of this nature invite us to consider possible links between emotion and politics in the present case. Do they serve as device to raise awareness? Here, the answer is less clear-cut. I think. So like the personal narratives in public are more and more present, and they were strongly present during the situation I described, but it's also like really strongly present in the youth space, where most of the debates are also centered on the expression of personal stories and personal experiences. Maybe what we need to like take into account is also like the characteristics of the person who came to this night. Like, as I briefly said in the introduction, the four young women were not that they were particular in the sense that they belong to organizations that are quite active on the political and social sphere in China. And so them, as well as the founder of the youth space, they have significant political resources, and they are really sensitive to potential censorship or other political controls. That says, the focus on the biographical stories is also a way to focus on the private and individual sphere. And it's, as a result, the discussion on centering on personal experiences is also a means both of keeping public authorities at a distance and hypothetically to reassure them about what is happening in this space. From the 1980s, there is a renewed emphasis on discourse which focuses on the narrative of one's own suffering. For example, there were separate groups, television show, interest in therapy, and so on. And narratives of suffering have evolved into a means of self-expression and expressing one's feeling. So, for example, the issues of politics, collective action, and theory related to feminism are not mentioned much in the debate following the presentation, even if knowing who the people were, like who came to do the presentation were, we can expect that there were more stuff about this. Instead, the discussion centers on people's expression of their personal suffering related to gender and gender inequalities. So, and going back to the presentation, there were two parts. Like first, the presentation of collective action that were set outside in the streets and that were presented as coming from negative emotion like anger. And at the second time, when there was a presentation of personal narratives, it was more turned and draw on a register of sadness or other negative emotions that assume to provide less of an incentive for action. So maybe we can see in this dual way that the woman used, like the activists use for presenting two different stuff as being a form of emotional management. That is to say, a set of action that involve highlighting or silencing certain feelings in order to make them appropriate to the situation. In doing so, they mitigate political sensitivity first, but at the same time, they make also all these discussions that happen after with the audience as juxtapolitical, because the uniqueness of one's individual experience is activated when combined with other stories from the audience, and the act of observing a collective, shedding lights on discrimination, and coming back to individual experience are thus intertwined. So the stories contain views and emotional knowledge resulting from shared experience, such as gender discrimination, marriage pressure, for example, and thus allow experiences to be shared in spite of the audience's diversity of social status, social roles, and professional backgrounds. And here we come back also to maybe a way of, by going through personal narratives, trying to get maybe broader public, broader audience than just the inner circle of social movement. So as a conclusion, in a context where there is like a strong regulation of social spaces and also a strong porosity between private and public spaces, maybe we can see here in this case emotion as an aspect of strategies for circumvention. because first, they make possible to obscure the political nature of certain discourses by refocusing narratives on individual suffering, while at the same time reassuring the public authorities to what is happening in this space. And at the same time, they also help reinforce the resonance between individual narratives and public problems. And maybe going back to this like public-private space, I think that in this case, the importance of the physical space of the gathering is really important, and therefore the possibility to meet and for bodies to be present together is quite important between these like interactions and debates, and maybe all of this regardless of the pure qualification of the space as being private or public, because what can be maybe more important is what the actor do of it and collectively appropriate it or change it. Thank you.
So thank you, Marie, for this very interesting introduction about the way we could also use emotions in our research on public spaces, which is often announced but rarely done. And also for coming to the issue of porosity of public and private space, which is a very recurring theme in the research on public spaces in East and Southeast Asia. And now I will leave the floor to Nguyen Van Minh, who will present his article, The Transformation of Mobility in Post-Doi Moi, Vietnam. So from China to Vietnam with Minh.
Good morning, everybody. I don't have a PPT, so bear with me. I'll try to stick to the 15-minute limit. Anyway, before beginning, I would like to thank a few people. So I joined GENEsYs in 2017. I would like to thank Vanessa and Pierre for letting me on board this amazing research team and project. I am grateful to have been given the chance to contribute an article to the last issue of Civilisation, and I'm honored to have been listed with other brilliant scholars and researchers. And finally, I would also like to thank our panelist discussant, Catherine Earle, because as a researcher on Vietnam myself, I have had the chance to meet and the pleasure to meet Catherine several times in the past 2 years, and I want to thank her for all the precious advice, suggestions, and insights that she kindly shared with me. So in my presentation today, I will use the article I wrote for Civilisation as a more general framework to develop an idea that I started developing actually more recently. An idea about how we as social scientists, we can analyze, think, and conceptualize space in general and urban space more specifically. As the title of my article and my presentation today suggests, my research is about mobility in Vietnam. So the starting point, the general assumption, is a common popular refrain in mobility studies literature, that traffic is, as much as any other more conventional or stationary public space, a site where conflicting memories, cultural expectations, and political interests are negotiated. So in my article, the primary aim was to show how mobility as a conceptual notion, as a conceptual framework, and traffic as one of its phenomenological manifestations can help us analyze political and social dilemma in contemporary Vietnam. I tried to do that by tracing the political and social genealogy of traffic and the evolution of the practices and meanings of mobility in the past 3 decades with a specific reference to Ho Chi Minh City. And in trying to bridge the gap between what I think is a very rich scholarship, theoretical scholarship on mobility, and a less rich embodied study of mobility, I use a research method called Motorbike Ethnography. So I borrowed this expression and this very method from Norwegian anthropologist Arve Hansen, in that I use a motorbike not just as an object of, but also a tool for observation. As soon as I started driving myself in Ho Chi Minh City and emerged into traffic as a driver rather than just as a passenger, new dimensions, new political, social, sensorial dimensions open up. In the article, I also tried to convey this process of adjusting my body as well as my persona to this means of transportation, and I tried to analyze how these has played such an essential role in my understanding of urban life in contemporary Ho Chi Minh City. So generally speaking, broadly speaking, the question that has been guiding my research is, how does mobility shape and in turn is shaped by culture? Or in other words, how can we think of movement, that is how, why, where people move, as a culturally, socially, and politically meaningful practice? So I would like to extrapolate, to isolate three main findings or notions that I discussed in my article, starting from governed mobility. So mobility's literature provides conceptual tools, very relevant conceptual tools, to understand how power, how meaning are intertwined with mobility, with movements, but whilst focusing on governing of mobility. Mobility studies usually fall short on understanding how societies are increasingly governed through mobilities, an instance that Barenold has called indeed governed mobility by merging Foucault's governmentality with mobilities study. So I'd like to make two examples out of it. In the early 2000s, for example, Vietnamese government has tried to, in tackling the issue of growing congestion in the city and pollution, has tried to limit the number of motorbikes that a citizen could register to just one. Later on, in the following years, they also tried to, and this is still being debated, to ban motorbikes from entering central parts of the city center in both Hanoi and Ho Chi Minh City. But both these propositions have met very strong resistance from the popular opinion, and thus the Vietnamese authorities were kind of forced to withdraw these propositions. In an instance that legal scholar Mark Sieder has labeled motorbike constitutionalism. So mobility here has become an arena where not just the right to the city is being discussed, but also an arena through which civic rights, people can understand and can learn about their own civic rights. So secondly, there is a narrative, a state-led narrative on new urban civilization that has been strongly emphasized by the Vietnamese state in order to create this structure of feeling about modernity. So the emphasis on a new urban civilization, Văn Minh Đô Thị in Vietnamese, has affected people's perception of how the modern city should look like, how the modern citizen should look like and behave like. So in order to try and control and regulate mobilities, national campaigns have been carried out, which somehow privilege modern mobilities, including, for example, cars, metro or rapid bus transit system, over more traditional means of transportation, including motorbikes, bicycles, and cyclos. Of course, these quotation marks, traditional means of transportation, have been relegated, not just spatially, being given less and less room in the city streets, but they've also been relegated socially and conceptually to represent less advanced, less modern ways of living. And thirdly, my focus is not just on infrastructures of mobility, that is the material aspect of mobility, streets, vehicles, bodies, but also on mobility as an infrastructure. There is a critical side through which politics is translated from a rationality, a planning, to a practice, an everyday life with all its social, political, material complexity. So traffic, as I said, has been largely the side where I conducted most of my fieldwork. traffic considered as at large as the assemblage of goods, people, bodies, and vehicles, not traffic in the strict sense of the term, in the sense of congestion. So traffic is indeed a place with its own physical boundaries, a place with its own rules and signs, but in as much as traffic has its own rules and signs, we can also think about it as a form of communication, a language. As a language has its own rules and its own limits and its own signs, and we can think of traffic as a way through which people can express themselves. And indeed, traffic is interactive and is mostly based on this interpretation, this constant interpretation of intents. So streets in Vietnam, not just in Vietnam, but as this is my case study, streets in Ho Chi Minh City are not just a blank space through which people transit. They're also they are also a stage where people can express their identity and can perform a variety of practices. This is also reflected, interestingly, in the very way the Vietnamese language conceptualizes the street. So street in Vietnamese is said like đường, and the classifier for street is con, which is usually ascribed to living beings rather than inanimate objects, thus leading us to think and conceptualize the street not as an inert object, but mostly as an assemblage of practices that take place on and because of it. So now to try and develop and push this idea, this framework that I developed in my article further, I would like to address a question, like a topic question, which the GENESYs project has been wondering ever since its beginning. So what is space? How can we conceptualize public space more specifically? I have recently read an article by Alice Stefanelli on traffic and mobility in Beirut. And in her article, she writes that mobility through cars, has actually changed the space-time, the very space-time of Beirut, contracting and squeezing time-space and allowing people to reach places, to go from A to B faster. So my question here, what I'm trying to think about is how can we conceptualize, how can we study space and urban space as social scientists? So much inspiration for my research comes from the practice and theory of rhythm analysis. That is the understanding of environment through the analysis of its rhythms. Rhythm analysis is not a new concept. It has been elaborated by French philosopher Henri Lefebvre in the 1980s as a way to better understand the relationship between bodies and between the space around them. So for me, it's interesting to notice that different professionals, not only urbanists, but also architects, social scientists, anthropologists, economists, have shown greater, more and more interest in understanding the rhythms of the modern metropolises. Brussels, Ho Chi Minh City, New York, all have different, all show different rhythmic patterns and configurations and different, of course, scales of movement. But there seemed to be a large agreement on the fact that all these metropolises share the same rhythm, the same pace of life. And indeed, urban life is usually described as fast, as hectic, as a never-ending motion to try and keep the economy going. If you try and Google the very word city, stock images of city usually show long exposure photos where traffic is turned into these indiscernible streams of lights. And this has two results. On the one hand, it dehumanizes the experience of traffic because it takes away the human component, bodies, out of the frame. And secondly, it turns streets into blank spaces, into conveyor belts for people's bodies and goods, without treating streets as places on their own with their meanings and practices. So I conclude with a brief reflection, which I draw from a literary scholar and sociologist called James Donald, who in his book Metropolis, the City as Text, has argued that there is no such thing as the city. City is above all an imagined environment in which both planners and people try to make sense of the space around them as it were a text to be read in a quest for urban legibility. But then I want to go back to Michel Desserteux, who has suggested that when we live, when we perform in the streets, in the urban space, we are always engaging in illegible improvisations. And once again, it might be informative to think of the city as a text which can be read, which can be performed. But for me, as informative as it might be, the metaphor of the city, the analogy of the city as text, actually is weak when it comes to identifying and understanding the economic, the political forces that determine and shape the rhythms of the city. So in order not to underplay the role of agency in making up the urban experience, I'd like to use the notion of rhythm analysis to try and think of the city, to propose another reading of the city. Instead of the city as text, the city as music, the city as a performance that can be performed on multiple levels. I think I ran out of time, so I'm going to stop there.
No, it's really all right. Thank you,
yeah.
Min, for this discussion. You presented first the mobility as a starting point to investigate Vietnamese society, but we now more and more see how this is a constitutive, interactive, and performative, and embodied also dimension of the Vietnamese society at large. And now we completely change the context, because we switch to the rural Laos also, with a paper presented by Rosalie Stolz from the Free University of Brussels, Freie Universität Berlin. Oh, sorry, not of Brussels, of Berlin. I'm sorry. We have very close titles from our university, as you see, and myself from the University of Brussels. But I will first give the floor to Rosalie.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Pierre, and thanks also to the organizers of the conference, and of course also to the editors of the special issue and the editorial assistant also. I think I've started sharing the screen. I hope you can see the slide. Yeah, but I think I should start the presentation. Just a second. Okay, it should work now. All right, so the title of our joint presentation, which is, as you just heard, based on a joint article that Pierre and I have written, is Emerging Public Spaces in Rural Laos. And I'm stressing rural here because it is based on our observation that the notion of the public space is often rooted in debates on urban contexts. And rural locales rarely come to one's mind when discussing it. So here we argue that there are benefits actually from using the concept of public space also in the countryside. Taking a pragmatic definition of the public space as a starting point, that means as a space openly accessible and where actions and events are visible, village paths, log fires, countryside fairs, communal buildings, etc. come to one's view. We also argue that the concept is instrumental for tracking the transformations of rural space when new forms and artifacts of public space are emerging. And ultimately, it allows to analyzing the ways in which the state is ingrained into what Holly High and Pierre Petit have called the minutiae of daily life of uplanders.
So drawing on our two case studies, we will highlight the commonalities, but also the differences underlying the transformation of public space in the rural highlands of Laos. and I've been working since 2009 in Huayong, a Thai village located in a small valley of Houaphanh province that you can see on the left of the slide. And you can see that it seems that there is a continuity with Plia that will be presented by Rosalie in the next seconds. In 2019, Huayong sheltered about 530 inhabitants who make their living from cultivating paddy rice in the valley and cash crops in the Swedens. A significant part of the population has left the village during the last decade, especially among the youth who head toward the capital, Vientiane. The village sided with the communist government during the civil war. It has some political elites, and some of those political elites are, I would say, big men of the area, and have developed also a sense of centrality among the neighboring villages.
And the other setting, which you can see on the right side of the slide, is the Skamu village of Blia, which is located in the northwestern province of Luang Namtha, where I've been working since 2013. Though this village has not always been here, it seems like a lowland setting actually, but in 1985 it was relocated under harsh conditions from its original locale close to a mountaintop to its present site. The Gamu of Blia understand themselves as primarily shifting cultivators, but they also cultivate, of course, an increasing range of cash crops in addition to animal husbandry and practices of gathering, hunting, as well as temporary labor migration proof resilient. In contrast to Huayong, the population of the village, roughly 550 inhabitants in 2015, remains stable. And another contrast is also that in Blia was rather torn between the two sides during the war and has a rather ambivalent history. And coming to the first point, we wish to locate, I want to go to another slide, but it doesn't work. Oh, yes, no, sorry. Locating what we call vernacular public spaces. In a Gamu village, this is a picture taken in Blia. There are various types of buildings. There are barns, there are houses, and both are connected to kin groups, but there are also a smaller number of buildings, so-called workhouses. Here I'm following Damlong Tayanin's wording for the Gamu term jong. Most workhouses of Blia are slightly elevated and quadrangular. Next to the unfurnished interior, their outside space to the front entails a hearth, often just a fireplace, very important, a seating platform, which you can see here, and a smithy. The workhouse is, we wish to argue, a neutral, rather neutral, vernacular public space, not connected to one particular kin group. And here, communal feasts and rituals take place. But beyond rituals, it's also the place that strangers, upon entering the village, strangers such as government officials or itinerant doctors or vendors, had to first. And it also plays a prominent role in everyday sociality. Those who stay in the village, not go to field and forest that day, enjoy spending part of this day at workhouses where time goes by more sociably and quickly. Neighbors regularly meet here and share information and gossip. While sitting outside, kin relations don't need to be foregrounded as they inevitably are inside houses.
So now we come to a second point, which is in contrast with the vernacular public spaces we have just discussed through the workhouse in Plia village, the emerging public spaces. After the core revolutionary period of the 70s and 80s, Laos has taken the road to development under the twin injunctions of international cooperation and the Laos socialist conception of progress. This is all the more visible since the turn of the millennium. The landscape of the village changed under the leitmotifs of development, escaping poverty, becoming civilized, and being prosperous. The promises of prosperity are a source of the state's power, as argued notably by Surinder Singh and Oli Hai. Government policies trigger changes in the houses themselves, such as the civic obligation to have mosquito nets, toilets, soap, etc. Another major difference was the introduction of new structures, new buildings, and new regulations that materialized the national urge for development. So we can have a look at the village boards of achievements of the village of Huayong. These boards are based on official certificates provided by the district authorities to testify the village's accomplishment as a socio-political economic goals promoted by the government. The boards are nailed to a panel in the central part of the village, an area where the dust road widens and where celebrations are hosted. In January 2020, 14 such official titles were displayed in Huayong. And you see a bit less on that picture that was taken maybe, let's say, maybe 6 or 7 years ago. But as you see, the story has gone on with new accomplishments. What were those official titles? It's a cultural village, it's a developed village, a modern health village. The village hosts a qualified self of the party, of the Youth Union, of the Women Union, and of the Laos Front for National Edification, all of them being a mass organization, as you can guess. The village is also free from problems of criminality and drugs. It has achieved gender equality. It is a competent village with a competent militia, and it has reduced the surface devoted to Sweden cultivation. Plia, in contrast, has a modest number of achievements to display, numbering 5 until now. Through the award of such boards, the state expresses its power to name, to take an agnostic concept, and has managed to create an emulation linking together the thousands of villages of Laos along a shared representation of progress. The village authorities, on the other hand, express their power to relate to the state by having accomplished the rise in the national hierarchy of achievements. The village achievement boards of Huayong are a prominent backdrop of pictures taken during official ceremonies, as revealed also on the post made by the local elites on their Facebook account, and you can see one of those posts made by the head of the village on the slideshow. In his seminal book on the production of social space, Henri Lefebvre coined the concept of fragmentation of space, the production of new categories of space based on sector and functions. According to him, this process typical of modern societies goes together with an homogenization of space in terms of material, management, control, and surveillance, but also communication, and also with hierarchization. Indeed, as the board system is replicated from one village to another, like other emerging forms of public spaces we don't have time to discuss here, all villages of the country become formally commutable and comparable in terms of status achievement. The system of boards is instrumental in creating, through its replicability and visuality, a banal nationalism, to take Billig's concept, a nationalism that does not appear through blatant assertions or collective pride, but rather through casual, unremarkable enactments that make people take the national we for granted.
So now we turn to the comparison of the communication in public spaces. And I wish to go on to the next slide, but I cannot because it disappeared from my screen at least. Shall I start sharing my screen again? Or where has the presentation gone actually? I'll try again. I don't know why it disappeared. I think that is a challenge of this. All right, so yes. Okay, there we are. So when we compare, we come back to the workhouse on the one hand, and then we have the communal hall there, which we are going to present in a few seconds. So coming back to the workhouse, these buildings are rather inclusive buildings. They don't have elevations or seats making people sit at different heats, and this translates into communicative practices as well. Rather than one's skin or other positions, statues being important, it is the entertaining character of one's words, the persuasive force of one's comments that attract the other people's attention. The public space of the workhouse is larger than the building, and its boundaries are highly permeable. What happens inside can be easily seen and heard outside. The workhouse's public space doesn't stop at its outer walls. Instead, many guests will not find their place inside anyway, but will crowd around the edges and contribute their musings and deliberations from outside. And some parts of feast and rituals generally place outside. So what's captured in the picture you can see here, that was taken during a wedding feast, is the moment in which the bride's kin attempted to sabotage the groom's kin's preparation. They successfully extinguished the fire and stole the cooking pot, much to the amusement of the public. By contrast to the workhouse, the communal hall in Blair doesn't have a transitional space between the inside and the outside.
And a specific feature of communal halls throughout Laos is the special organization of its rectangular space. In Huayong, the authorities speak from the side of the room, hosting the table of honors that you can see on the left of the picture, under the portraits of the fathers of the Lao Revolution for the initiated Kaison and Supanovong that you can see just in the middle of the world, surrounded by a map of the world, certificates of village achievements, and posters of the National Army. When it is used, the microphone circulates around this side of the room only, and we elaborate on this dimension of the sonic public space in our article. Facing the authorities, as you can see on the right of the slide, the villagers sit on benches, like pupils in a classroom, many of them writing in notebooks during the meetings. This is also the case in Plia, albeit with less furniture and without writing utensils. The lack of an adequate number of tables and benches in Plia further exacerbates the social dichotomy. The visiting official sits at the front on benches while the villagers either squat or sit on low stools. The communication is clearly marked by lectures of officials and, only if prompted, brief responses by men who are most often also local office holders. The lecture is given in Lao, which is more or less understood by the male and younger parts of the audience. The dichotomy and hierarchy between people and the representatives of the states are properly actualized in the visual and the sonic properties of the meeting. This building could be described as a Foucauldian dispositif to materialize the state and to make the state subjects embody the discipline expected from them.
So to conclude, we've begun by identifying vernacular public spaces in rural villages in upland Laos. Then we've moved to the emerging public spaces, taking here the achievement boards as an example. Finally, we've compared the social spatial patterns at a workhouse with those in a communal hall. In the article, based on further examples such as schoolyards, the zoning and mapping of the village territory, a picture of which you've seen on the first slide, and also the loudspeaker announcement system, we've argued that applying the concept of public space to rural settings makes the increasing subdivision of the village space into different categories visible. We relate to Henri Lefebvre, who argued that the present era is characterized by a, to quote, dominant trend towards fragmentation, separation, and disintegration, unquote. This is exactly what's going on in Huayong and in Blair, where technical and structural measures change the local appraisal of space and create a distinction between a domestic and a space that falls into the domain of the state. The multiform emergence of public space in the village context certainly shapes the inclusion of the rural uplands into the socialist nation state of today and even more of tomorrow. Thank you very much.
So thank you, Rosalie. We remain in Laos, and our last presentation brings us to I would say, cultural capital of Laos, Luang Prabang, with a presentation by Phil Wilcox from Bielefeld University in Germany. So, Phil, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, and thank you to everyone involved in this process. Hopefully you can now all see my screen. Someone wave at me if you can, hopefully. I'd like to say a big thank you to everybody for inviting me, for the editors of the special issue, and now would be a great time to start thinking about coffee. Seems curiously appropriate for mid-morning. So allow me to start with a quick map of Laos for some context. We have Luang Prabang in the north, recognized by UNESCO as a World Heritage Site in 1995. on the basis of its blending of European and Lao architecture. And that word blending and fusion is going to be very important in this presentation. It's commonly considered the cultural center of Laos, and in Idenso's terms, a place to stage an idealized version of the nation through the combination of splendor, culture, and tradition. Coffee as a crop was first introduced to Laos by the French colonizers and grown in the south, in the far south on the Bolivian plateau until very recently. But in recent years, it has been introduced to upland areas in the north as a replacement crop for opium. And Lao coffee is renowned for a round taste, and I can personally attest to its high caffeine content. I'm going to highlight 3 propositions in this paper, which are all based on things I wrote for the article in the special issue. We're going to start here. There are many cafes or coffee houses in these colonial type buildings in Luang Prabang, and I'm aware that there are lots of people listening who've been to Luang Prabang who may even have had coffee in the building in front of us. This is what is popularly termed the French bakery. Like many coffee houses in Laos, in Luang Prabang, it sells coffee marketed as a traditional product. But I'm going to argue here that it's not actually that simple for 3 reasons. 1, it is sold in a style that is not authentically Lao, and 2, it isn't actually local to Luang Prabang area until very recently. Crucially, coffee cultures in Luang Prabang reproduce, in my opinion, agendas of heritage and heritage spaces in Luang Prabang more generally. And that is in this unequal fusion, an unequal blending of Lao and European, which privileges the European over the Lao, and with the more local Lao spaces and practices subservient or pushed to the periphery. So, excuse me just a second. So here is my first proposition, that coffee shops in Luang Prabang are apparently accessible spaces, but they're not really accessible to all. And I'm thinking here about Lowe and his arguments on spatialized geographies and multiple meanings of spaces. And in Paige West's brilliant ethnography about coffee culture, she argues that everyone in the process of coffee forms certain expectations about the others in the process. And in relation to Laos, we have people buying coffee in these coffee houses thinking that it's Lao coffee, often it is, but whether that really is a traditional product and the style in which it's presented as apparently traditional or not is really worth thinking about. And from there, we can also think about coffee as a process that really quite eerily mirrors larger discourses of heritage. So I think it would be useful to have a look at one of the menus in one of these coffee houses in a little bit more detail. This is one of the things that I got very excited about when I was last on fieldwork in Laos. This is the menu from Joma, which is one of the largest coffee shops in Luang Prabang, but also has outlets in Vientiane and elsewhere within Southeast Asia. Let's just pause a minute to look at prices in Joma. If 25,000 Lao kip, that's about 2.15 euros or just over $2.5 US, is what they're going to charge us for a chai tea latte. And most of the population of Laos actually lives on under $2.5 US a day. Then I'd argue that a really obvious reason why these spaces are not actually that accessible to most of the Lao population is price. Notice, please, also that the menu is written entirely in English. And let's just pause again on what is actually being served. We are offered a tempting array of teas on the left and a pumpkin spiced latte on the right, an item that's probably familiar to most of us who've walked past a Starbucks or some similar establishment recently. And looking at this TripAdvisor review that I found, I think this tells us a lot about what and who these spaces are actually designed for. So here, MCQ 2015 from the UK tells us where to come if we become nostalgic for a delicious cake while we're in Luang Prabang. And nostalgia in relation to Luang Prabang is a really, really interesting term that really jumped out at me. And I'm thinking here specifically about David Berliner's work about nostalgia as a driving force for what is presented as heritage in Luang Prabang. I doubt that the person who wrote this TripAdvisor review was aware of that, but it really jumped out to me as something that aligns so well with a lot of what is written about Luang Prabang. Now, as I said on the previous slide, the prices in such establishments are too high for most local people. And it's interesting to me that the local people who do work there, who are there, are working there mostly in a service capacity. So I'd argue here that we have what Moser has argued as a soft boundary that makes these places accessible, but kind of not accessible. But as many tourists go to these places, for people who work in and around tourism, for example, drivers who take tourists to various locations, hanging around outside such establishments is a very good place to find them. We'll talk a little bit more in a couple of minutes about actual Lao coffee, but again, I invite you all to consider what really is Lao about a latte. I think there's also a lot in here about coffee and its relation to class and a place to perform identity. Now, as several of our previous speakers this morning have noted, these spaces are not neutral, but they are very interesting spaces for people to form and project certain forms of identity. And GENESYs and the work on doing class, it's something you do in and around coffee. And the relationship between those two things being a very long one, I think is very important here. It's also a place to kind of perform purchasing power. And in such establishments, consumers are often invited to make a difference with their purchases, a narrative that's familiar to a lot of us from the global north, or buying our coffee in environmentally friendly packaging. And again, this is back to kind of West's idea about ideas about what other people think, what people think about other people in the coffee chain and how that produces certain kinds of space. My second proposition is probably my most important one, and this is about coffee reflecting and reproducing other dominant agendas about space, especially heritage space in Luang Prabang. Now, heritage agendas in Luang Prabang prize fusion, and they prize this connection between the colonial and the local, which sounds marvelous, but as anthropologists, we're always inclined to say, well, it's not really that simple and it's really rather complicated. So this is an unequal fusion. And coffee is a really, really good example, again, of something that prizes the European largely over the Lao. This is why I would argue that it is European style of coffee that proliferates in Luang Prabang and its coffee shop. And here is a cup of Lao coffee in Lao style, brewed in a bag served over condensed milk. Notice, please, though, that it's served at an outside drink stall. Staife and Bushell wrote a really cool article about unequal fusion and its relationship to food. And they noticed that where Lao food is served at restaurants within the heritage zone in Luang Prabang, you quite often get a lot of explanation about Lao ingredients in a way that you don't get with other forms of fare. And when I checked TripAdvisor last week to prepare for this presentation, I noticed that of the top 10 restaurants in Luang Prabang, only one is listed as traditionally Lao. Others went by the term Asian or fusion. There's that word again. So in emphasizing heritage, I think the problematic bits of heritage that don't feed into this narrative of splendor, culture, and tradition get edited out. Coffee is a really good example of that. There's a lot of it in Luang Prabang. Here are some coffee berries. They produce coffee, right? Yeah, but not necessarily there. But it still gets marketed as a traditional product. And as I said at the start, northern coffee, i.e. coffee grown in upland areas of the north, is an invented tradition of a tradition that was imported to the south of the country by the French. But again, that's not really emphasized in the selling of coffee in the coffee houses in the heritage zone in Luang Prabang itself. So finally then, to tie this up, I think that space making in Luang Prabang and in the heritage zone of Luang Prabang particularly is a process, and it's a process of multiple actors that converge to create this apparently iconic space. And I'd just like to tie coffee here in relation to wider gastroscapes of that. Now, markets, food stores, we have abundant fresh food. And I would argue that these are the more local spaces. interestingly, that market on the right of the screen at the top, yeah, that's not in the center of Luang Prabang, it's actually outside. And I don't find that very surprising. Because often this is food that's not marketed to tourists, and if you want it, you're probably going to take it somewhere else in order to eat it. And I was very frequently asked to move out of the way of tourist photo shots in a market, even within central Luang Prabang, that happens in the morning, because clearly I didn't fit into a sort of authentic holiday snap that a lot of tourists want to take. But again, I think this is an example of local food being placed secondary to a sort of idealized version that is presented within the heritage zone. Colonial influence in Luang Prabang is quite obvious. It's also quite obvious in its food. Again, with any kind of narrative of the negative aspects of colonialism not emphasized. And we can really see here in food an exercise in nostalgia, that is, for the past without the bad bits. Coffee as a colonial product in these buildings, nobody asks too many questions about how coffee got there in the first place, or why coffee as Lao people drink it mostly is so difficult to find. I went to a coffee store quite nearby where this photo was taken. It was an outdoor space with people offering coffee in that traditional style I showed you earlier. And the owner told me that she'd had a menu made in English, but very few tourists actually stopped. Occasionally they would take photographs. It's quite hot outside, there's no free Wi-Fi. Prices were, however, about a quarter cheaper of what I showed you on the menu earlier. And McCannell might have viewed this as that sort of classic, authentic experience. But I imagine that some tourists might also raise eyebrows at the hygiene standards. I noticed a cat sleeping on the table behind me. But that is the sort of space where one can actually encounter locals, and is a really good example of that narrative of tourists and vagabonds moving within the same space. Interestingly, I found sandwiches for sale on menus in some Luang Prabang coffee houses, not always in baguettes, but bagels, on the other hand, now that is an item that one can find. So if you want to find real local food and local coffee, you need to travel outside the heritage zone. And there are lots of actors performing and perpetuating this unequal heritage space. And going back to Stephen Bushell's argument about unequal fusion of food, my argument here is there's no need to stop at that point. Coffee is also a really, really good example to think with and think through the making and performance of this unequal heritage space. And this was the conclusion of the article, that heritage space in Luang Prabang is loaded, selective and politicized. And what is presented as coffee culture encompasses all of those things too. Thank you very much.
So thank you, Phil, for this presentation. It was perfect for a presentation at 10 a.m. and I just had my third coffee right now. Unfortunately, it's not Lao coffee, not even Choma coffee, but just Nescafe Gold Espresso. And apart from this, thanks very much also for discussing, I would say, the inequality regarding access to public space that are supposedly accessible to everyone. That's a very important thing to keep in mind for the whole volume. Now, I would like to invite Catherine Earle for a discussion. So Catherine Earle is from the Royal Melbourne Institute of Technology, and she contributed to this volume. So I hope that she is not frustrated not to be able to present her paper, but I think that some of her ideas will also come into the discussion of the 4 papers of this morning. So, Catherine, you have the floor.
Lovely, thank you so much. And hello from Ho Chi Minh City. Actually, I'm not going to present too much of my own paper. Firstly, I'd like to say thank you for the invitation to discuss the 4 papers that we heard today out of the collection, and thank you to the organizers of the conference. I want to thank each of the authors for sharing their fascinating research today. I really enjoyed reading the papers, and my comments will focus on the cross-cutting empirical themes about public space that I noted in the written papers. So some of my comments relate to things you didn't actually mention in your talk. So I apologize also if I have misinterpreted something. To start with, East and Southeast Asian socialist public spaces challenge universal ideas about public space as space that is simply shared or communal. Firstly, public space is malleable. The 4 papers convey 5 cross-cutting case studies. They show us that public space is unfixed and unstable. In Beijing, there's a pluralization of public spaces. Youth spaces reveal that public space is not neutral. It's experienced in different ways, and it's less heavily reliant on institutional regulation. There are a wider range of spaces and new spaces dedicated to free time, time outside of productive activities. They are outside work and study, as well as being outside personal and domestic time. In Luang Prabang, there are dualities in public spaces. Joma Coffee House, we just heard about, reveals that spaces are experienced in different ways. They're open and closed. They're inclusive and exclusive. They're for leisure and work, for coffee drinking and coffee serving. They're familiar and strange. In a European style, familiar to European visitors. In a European style, strange to local staff. In Ho Chi Minh City, Motorbike Ethnography reveals that public spaces are experienced in different ways. Traffic is a place, a stage. On a motorbike, the rider and the passenger share the same space, but enjoy different experiences. The passenger helps, the rider responds, for example, by taking a shady route. Social status is conflated with transport mode. The motorbike space overlaps physically and figuratively. It overlaps public and private. It overlaps individual and collective. In rural upland Laos, similarly, public space is experienced in different ways. There is continuity with old forms of public space. There is change with new forms of public space emerging, but there are no clear patterns across different locations. Some spaces are highly visible and relatively fixed in their use. Others are less visible and transform while in use. Some are self-regulating, others are regulated by authorities, including the state. The papers highlight public space being malleable. Is it a new form of public space, some kind of semi-public space? Secondly, accessibility of public spaces. Each paper questions the accessibility of public spaces and to what extent they are communal, open, or free for use. I noticed the commercialization of public space is present. In Lao coffee houses, pricing is one factor that makes public spaces inaccessible to the local population. Pricing is excluding. It creates exclusive public spaces. In Ho Chi Minh City, pricing in coffee shops, along with visibility, are factors that encourage young people to go elsewhere, to go around Di Vom Vom on motorbikes. Some public spaces are more accessible than others. Beijing's youth spaces are non-commercial and theoretically accessible, but not neutral. They are places where some gather. Also, I include 2 points made by Rosalie and Pierre in their written paper about other public spaces not included in the presented papers, which center on influences of materialities and technologies on public spaces. For example, convergent culture and participatory public spaces in socialist contexts, and youth leisure spaces. To these, I add migrant public spaces, including non-citizens, temporary residents, shadow citizenry, and their right to the city, their right to narrate, etc., as well as people with disability and their access to public space. Turning back to the papers and what they do cover. Thirdly, hierarchies and asymmetries shape public space, and they are experienced through the senses. Coffee shops in the heritage area of Luang Prabang are hierarchical. Eurofusion combines local and imported elements unequally to conceal power imbalance. Tastes, while familiar to outsiders, are sanitized and atypical for locals. Lao hybridity fuses elements from south and north, also unequally, also concealing power imbalance. Beyond the taste and aroma of coffee, in upland Lao villages, sound positions citizens in space through language, kinship, as state subjects in official announcements. In Beijing's youth spaces, narrating biographical experience positions citizens in space as listeners with emotional connections, as gender activists, as distant from ideal state subjects, as invisible from or less visible to official scrutiny. In Ho Chi Minh City's two-wheel traffic, not voice but touch, embodied practices of riding position citizens in space. Young men show ideal masculine subjectivity. Young women, street ninjas, challenge ideal feminine subjectivity. Spatial mobility links to class mobility in social hierarchies characterized by machine over manual transport and unlimited distance over close proximity. Mastery of the motorbike figuratively shows mastery of the social world. Traffic makes social hierarchies visible to everyone, Min argues, and the motorbike itself acts as an agent of democratization in a progressively stratified society. Freedom. Briefly, I want to mention freedom in the context of authoritarian states. Riding a motorbike across Ho Chi Minh City at night provides freedom and has soul. Sitting outside at night in an upland Lao village provides freedom. Open air and nighttime, spatial and temporal dimensions that transform public space while in use. On the other hand, mapping and fencing of land in rural Lao clearly delineates public and private spaces, sometimes in new ways. Fourth, I note transformations of state discourses of development, moving beyond simple linear trajectories of state-led development. I want to propose the presence of the state and other authorities as entrepreneurial agency, as innovation that is dynamic, not fixed, responsive, not policing or regulating, a form of convergence or participation. In Beijing, the incorporation of grassroots spaces into state-governed spaces shows the flexibility and adaptability of authoritarian states. Mass organizations have varying relationships with other organizations. Spaces are delegated and regulated. Private spaces are inspected by the state, by socialist organizations and private organizations. In Ho Chi Minh City, private spaces are inspected by parents or removed so that domestic spaces are shared using an economic rationale, such as renting out the house or the room. Outside, local people are heavily involved in crowding the streets and devising innovative ways of using motorbikes to move and to do business. In Luang Prabang, local people are not involved in the preservation of heritage, which is the center of doing business. The audience and market are ever present in the experience of Eurofusion heritage in urban Lao. In rural Lao, there are differing state efforts to include upland areas and differing successive attempts by villages to relate to the state. Lastly, forms of the state. Public space highlights that there is a lack of central or universal features. Rosalie and Pierre describe rural upland Lao as part of the socialist nation state of today and tomorrow. Phil labels Lao cities as having nominally socialist spaces. Marie links Beijing's youth spaces with porous identity in a post-socialist institutional environment. Min labels Vietnam as late socialist and highly authoritarian. Yet these contrasting forms of Asian socialist states share features. Commercialization, privacy, and the service sector appear to be core components of Asian socialist public spaces. Making money, living comfortably, improving society, caring for others and the environment are key features of Asian socialisms. Although these translate to different practices and different scales in different places. Market reform socialisms of East and Southeast Asia in the 21st century are not like centrally planned European socialisms of the 20th century. As I conclude and we open up to discussion, I would like to pose several questions. Initially, are the public spaces of socialist Asia new, unique, in the making? By not thinking of public space as simply shared or communal, I ask you to consider Rosalie and Pierre's point of transforming space towards an agenda, such as state business or village land certificates as an example. Next, to what extent is public space in socialist Asia racialized, characterized by racial or ethnic tensions or connections? On the one hand, Lao coffee houses show asymmetrical fusion of imported and local elements. On the other, a foreigner is asked to step out of frame for a tourist shot. The urban Lao case shows global post-colonial racial asymmetries as well as local ones. How relevant is gender? Gender activism in China's cities responds to a mismatch of skills, salaries, declining employment, singlehood, distance from a heteronormative ideal, among other issues. Moto mobilities in Vietnam's largest city exemplify gender differentiated social experiences. In the upland Lao cases, there is gender segregation in the Plia communal hall, but inclusion in the workhouses. Huayong has achieved gender equality. To what extent can public spaces in socialist Asia become gender neutral or equal? Is that desirable in an era of sustainable development goals? As Pierre noted about age, we've not focused on age explicitly, although youthfulness characterizes most of the urban public spaces examined in the papers. Disability, I mentioned briefly earlier. These intersections relate to public space being made through practices that transform them while in use. To what extent are Asian socialist public spaces intersectional, sensory, self-regulating, while being under rules and some or many forms of regulation? To what extent are they place dependent? To what extent are they socio-historically situated? To what extent does public space enable participation in the state, with the state, or against the state? In what ways, in what new ways to participate, well, in what ways might they, be desirable? What are the risks and what tactics are deployed? And with that, I will end. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Catherine. This is a real view from the hilltop, I would say, on all our contributions. And you raise many fascinating questions, and also you show very well the common threads also linking the different articles. So I think that the best way also is maybe now to ask the different authors if they want to have to give some comments on your own comments. And we can just very classically begin by Marie, if she has some answers to provide to or new comments to provide to your questions and comments. So maybe Marie first, or if you want, we can also begin by someone else.
Yes, I will start, and I will.
Okay, thank you, Marie.
First, thank you, Catherine, for these really interesting comments and links made between all the presentation this morning. I don't know if I will have really strong answers. Like your question are pretty big questions, so maybe I will have more not super detailed answer about maybe the gender and how relevant is the gender regarding this public space process in East Asia. I think that even if my presentation today was the question of gender was pretty important, and in this situation it was really important, but I think that what I've seen on my fieldwork, maybe class and social origin was more important than gender, because most of the people that were going there were young skilled workers, they graduated from university, which is not the case of most of the Chinese people from that age, which is there is more or less 20% of this age class that is going to university. And I think that what I've seen during all this time in the youth spaces, it's that the people that were maybe like more willing to come, that have not that many problem with the fact of coming, of speaking, it was more about the fact that they were coming from cities and not rural zone, that they were graduated from better universities or better program than the others, or that they were doing their studies in Beijing. Most of the people, they were not from Beijing, but the one that have been to university in Beijing or that have been in good universities were more able to speak a lot, and some other people were less, like, not important, but less vivid in this kind of spaces. And like when we were all talking about this public-private difference, and like who are the where are the borders of the public space, there is also like who is coming and who is thinking that he can come. And one of the people I met there, he was telling me, like, the first time I wanted to come and I arrived at the door and I didn't enter, I was like, no, these people are much more interesting than me, and I'm not maybe good enough to go in this place. And like that was a male. And I think that this male-female discrimination is not that important regarding the class and social origin. That is maybe more important. And maybe to answer, or try to answer, because I'm trying to get my words and my ideas at the same time, to another question, like how these spaces are trying to, like, are with the space, against the space, with the state, against the state, or in the state, and how they transform. I think that, at least in China, but for sure for my fieldworks, it's always with the state. Like you cannot be totally apart, even if you try to do some negotiation. I think the concept of negotiation is always really important, but there is always a possibility of a control, and it depends on local initiative, but also on temporalities. But there is always this working with the state, and this, like, always negotiation with the state. And at the same time, I think that we need to take into account the market, because, for example, I said that most of the activities and most of the, like, you can come whenever you want in a youth space for free, etc. But with the years going, this question of commodification has been going stronger and stronger, because there were like increase in the price of the accommodation, the place, and how it costs for the funders. So there is also this question of market that is maybe really important for these spaces to be, and to be on a long time in these places. That's it.
Okay, thank you, Marie. Now I will leave the floor to my neighbor and friend Min also.
Yes, thank you, Catherine, for all your remarks. I'm also gonna try and address my ideas as they come to my mind, so very randomly, I would say. I guess that once again, I don't want to sound like I'm obsessed with like physics and quantum physics, but I guess the reflection that I've been reading a lot in these types of books lately might resonate with all these themes that we've been discussing. So in quantum physics, there is no such thing as space. Space is given by the relationship between the objects that are in space. So yes, that we might start thinking also about like public space and urban space, not by the definition that we bestow upon them. Instead of starting by thinking like this is a public space, this is a private space, let's think of it as a space in power, I would say. So something that is made up of the relationships that are created on it. Of course, then we can start thinking of public space as the expression of certain kinds of behaviors. But to me, it's interesting to think about the multidimensional space as a place where many things can happen, not necessarily the things that those spaces are meant to. Talking about transforming public spaces, for example, I didn't mention in my presentation today, but I did that in my article. about the motorbikes used as mobile places of intimacy. So a sort of privacy, of a private space is carried out and is created is overlapped onto public spaces. And this establishes different regimes of visibility and invisibility. So that's one thing. Second thing is compliance with or tension against the state. So we are aware that in late socialist or authoritarian East and Southeast Asia, however we want to call it, the presence of the state within public spaces is pretty strong and deep rooted. In Vietnam, this is very common and very out there, very clear in the forms of propaganda, billboards, but also laws that are trying to address how people should behave both within public spaces, but also in their own domestic spaces. And I think that I addressed some of those laws in my article. But anyway, there is this I would say widespread compliance with state narrative regarding modernity in Vietnam. I'm thinking about the research of Eric Arms, for example, but also others that have studied how people tend to comply with these ideals on and around modernity, even when their own life is at stake. So people who have been displaced from their house because new urban projects have been carried out tend to accept these ideals of modernity and tend to contribute to this cause, even though their life is at stake. And then to also leave the floor to the other presenters, the importance of the senses, of the sensorial dimensions in public spaces, in performing, in doing, in conceptualizing public space is as relevant, I guess, as another dimension which is often neglected, which are like affects, sensations, feelings, and mental health of people, not just health. Because of course we can think of problems regarding pollution, congestion in large metropolises such as Ho Chi Minh City. But then this also comes down to mental health issues sometimes. So I guess we've discussed about it. This topic was addressed in one of yesterday's panels. But anyway, I would like also to stress the importance, and that's something that is missing both in my article and right now in my research, but the importance of addressing also the mental life of people, not just the everyday practices and the sensorial aspect of everyday life.
Thank you, Min. Maybe Rosalie can also provide some feedback to the comments by Catherine.
Yes, thank you very much. So thank you, Catherine, for your generous reading and the indeed inspiring comments. And to keep it short, just 2 points I want to comment on. This is what you mentioned, the sensory expression, like Min just mentioned. So the importance of the sensory dimensions of the constitution of public space. And what we wanted to do, Pierre and I, was also to bring back materiality and the sensory, and the affectory dimensions of the materiality, as well as also what you mentioned, the sonic space. We have treated it in the article, but not in the presentation, unfortunately, and that are these loudspeaker announcements. And we found both are very important for making up public space and also for the local imagination of the persons as citizens, as subjects, and also those who, of course, have to behave in accordance with these announcements, come to a meeting, for instance, and so on. So these sonic properties of the public space are quite important, we think, and should be also developed further in the future, as well as also the materiality not as taken for granted. There are these kinds of buildings, but as we mentioned, the communicative practices and also the social spatial aspects. You mentioned gender. We haven't treated it here in the presentation in detail, but it's certainly important. And one point is the ethnic dimension that you mentioned. That is really crucial. And there's been a difference in both our settings, which has been tackled more in our paper, Huayong and Blier. And it's not only the ethnic issue, are these the Taiwat or the Gamu, but also the particular history of these villages in the second, and of course in the war, that in the aftermath of the Second Indochina War. Very important. So what you can see is in the boards of achievement, Pierre, perhaps you want to add to this, they are actually, well, so many boards of achievement, so many certificates, they're even coming into the second round, I think. So this is the cultural village even already. Blier is very far from becoming a cultural village. And this is very much to do not only with the ethnic identification, being a Gamu, but being a Gamu who have rather ambivalent history, who have fought, some of them at least, on the wrong side. And this is actually quite important. So we have come really to the micro-histories in the areas, which are quite diverse, in order to understand the different power of the villages to relate to the state and how it actually materializes in the form of the public space. I think I'd end here. Pierre, do you wish to add to this?
To Catherine's comments, I really liked also your raising the attention to the fact that public spaces are unfixed and unstable and can be experienced in different ways. Something that we did not really investigate, I think, in our presentation and maybe in the other paper, is the kind of switcher, so that makes pass from one situation to another. So we should have also a kind of pragmatic approach to public space, trying to find what are the codes for switching from one situation to another. And this can take different forms also. I think that the sonic dimension is very important with public announcement, for example, or just performative statements made by local leaders about the present use of a space, but also visual dimensions, like the use of flags, for example, that transform a place for a national event, for example. Of course, I'm very interested also by your second general question about racialized and gender dimensions of the public spaces. And of course, this is very important, I'm sure, even if we should have other dimensions like social classes in mind as well, of course. For the racialized dimension, I would like to bring the attention to the fact that the article by Tim Oakes and Yang take place in Guizhou, in ethnic where most of the in a city where in two cities, in fact, where most of the population are ethnic minorities. And the idea of the Chinese urban planner is to redesign the main buildings of the large places of the city to make them fit with the ideal representation of ethnicity, which is something considered as very derogative by the local ethnic minorities of the place. So there is something going on about the representation of ethnic identity in those cities, and in this article, of course. And yes, sure, gender is a central issue. You have seen certainly that in the village communal hall that we have presented, all people were men, with just a few exceptions. I would say exception due to women speaking on behalf of their husband when they were deaf. That's the only reason bringing a woman to the village communal hall in Huayong at least. So sure, there are a lot of things to say, but I will now leave the floor to Phil for the last comments on the comments.
Thank you very much. I think it's great to be the last person to speak because I can just say I agree with a lot of what's already been said. But Catherine, thank you so much for some really fantastic comments. And I love this idea of thinking through the dualities and thinking about space as malleable. I'd just say a couple of things about your first two questions. Starting with this idea of public space in the making. I think it's really helpful to dig deeper into who is driving that process. And I think in relation to Luang Prabang, it's been quite very well argued that there is quite a strong conflation between the agendas of UNESCO and the authorities, in the sense that neither encourages any scrutiny of the problematic bits of history and allow for the presentation of a fairly selective narrative of the past that emphasizes beauty and splendor and architecture, etc., without really very much critical scrutiny of that. And I'm sure that a lot of visitors to Luang Prabang are not, not particularly interested in digging very much into that either. So I think these things kind of converge pretty well. But I also think it's worth thinking about the different actors in this process and how their interests converge on each other or not. I've been told quite repeatedly over the years in Luang Prabang by local people or people who've migrated to work or study there, I don't know very much about UNESCO. I don't know very much about heritage. The putting these things together as a kind of state project, but nobody is encouraged to ask too many questions about, I think is quite interesting. And another thing a lot of people have said to me over the years is, we just need Luang Prabang to stay the same because it's such a big driver for visitors and therefore for income. But I do have a slight problem with some of the narratives of Luang Prabang that put locals in this really passive position that, UNESCO does certain things, visitors do certain things, and local people get squeezed out. As with a lot of stereotypes, there is some truth in that, but it's not a complete picture. And I think even if people do not know a massive amount about what is being done and why and for whom, I'm very reluctant to put local people in this very passive position. People just deciding, actually, if you want to pay lots of money to live in a museum space, I'm off to live in the suburbs where I can do normal things. In a sense, that is a kind of action in itself. And I think there's a lot of that. And this is why I think it really is important to think carefully about who is driving change and what the parties in this know about each other, as well as what they actually do or not. And that kind of leads me on to the second point. You asked about racial or ethnic tensions. Yeah. Isn't it easy to put locals and tourists in this binary dichotomy? And as we know, Laos is one of the most ethnically diverse countries in the world. Although I would agree that Luang Prabang is made into and performs a predominantly lowland Lao version of identity, you don't have to dig very far beneath that to see that a lot of the workforce supporting those businesses, at least until COVID arrived, were often ethnic minority migrants from the countryside. And if we can problematize locals as homogeneous, and that's problematic, then we also need to problematize tourists and visitors as problematic. And I think one of the really fascinating things about heritage, tourism, World Heritage Sites in Luang Prabang generally is all this stuff about blending European and Lao traditions. That's fine. And until very recently, a lot of the consumers of that heritage were people, or are people. Obviously, COVID's caused a major disruption from the global north, but numbers of visitors from East Asia have been rising year on year and year. Now, what that is going to produce in terms of space and how space is transformed, I don't have an answer to that, but I really, really think that is something worth watching extremely carefully. So I hope that also suggests something about this idea of space in the making, what it might become. I don't know, let's do some follow-up research on that. That would be fantastic. I don't know if that's helpful, but those are my initial thoughts.
Now, I don't know if you are still here, Catherine. It's very destabilizing, in fact, to manage a conference on hybrid style, because I don't know if people are there or not. But anyway, so you have heard the comments on your comments. Maybe you have comments on our comments on your comments now also, and some reaction to our interventions.
Hello. Yes, I'm still here. Do I have comments on the comments on the comments? I've written a lot of notes about the comments on the comments. And right now my brain is very full of a lot of really interesting ideas. And I'm not sure how organized those ideas are right now. It's interesting which parts of my comments that speak to you, like which ones you chose to speak about. And the themes that came through often are the very social themes. They're less so about the form of the space, but the interaction, the interactive elements between peoples, and including multi-stakeholders. So we have this constant presence of the state in our lives. If it's not a physical presence, it may be a digital presence or an unknown presence. Maybe we feel the presence without being able to see the presence or hear the presence, something like this. So I'm interested that a lot of your feedback on my comments has been around the social aspects. What struck me in the papers was actually how much economic stuff was in there around like pricing and commodification, and the social class articulated as a difference in living standards. So it's a material aspect to the social use of space or something like this. That it's very hard to articulate, make a list, you know, it's hard to articulate a list of these things. So I'm not sure I've got a lot of cogent comments to make now at the end, but I'm very pleased to hear like the breadth of your responses. And I think that's all I've got to say. If you have more, please share more comments.
Yes, thank you, Catherine. As you say, it's always interesting to see what remains the blind spots also in our answer, and this should be also something very instructive for us. And maybe that based on this, we will put a last layer on our introduction to the special issues. So that's really instrumental in the design of the very last layers of this introduction. I don't know if there are other questions or issues raised by the audience, but I think that we have come to the end of this early morning session. This means that we have I would say a quarter for a new coffee break. I thank Phil Wilcox. And so we meet again in about 15 minutes at 15 past 11 for a discussion about political issues. I don't have the program now, so this is about digital nationalism. Okay, thank you to everyone. Thank you to all the speakers, the orators of this morning, and meet you again in 15 minutes.
This is for the fourth session. It is about discourse and symbol, new political identities in East Asian youth. I am Thierry Kellner. I'm lecturer in Chinese foreign policy here at ULB, and I'm very pleased to chair this last session. We will have three guest speakers for this last session, who will bring us to China, to Hong Kong, and finally to Japan. Because of the schedule, we will have first the presentation of Chen Zhang, and after a few comments from Frédéric Pognard, and after that we will continue with the presentation of Ida Leung, and to finish with Jeffrey Hall. So let's start with Chen Zhang from the Queen's University Belfast. Chen, you have the floor.
Thank you, Thierry. Let me just share my screen. So everyone can see this all right?
Yeah, that's great.
Yes.
Okay, so this is slightly further away from the theme of the panel, as I'll be talking about transnational conservatism and the connections or entanglement between these ideas in the sort of co-construction of the binaries or dichotomous thinking between China and a perceived decline, West in decline. And but Yuan internet users play an important role in the production of the popular geopolitical discourse I'm examining here, even though I don't pay particular attention to the youth as such. So the research itself is going to cover both intellectual and popular social media discourses in the Chinese context. But I want to start by talking a little bit about the bigger puzzle behind this, which is the co-production of binaries such as the West versus the non-West. And so in this first part, I'm going to talk about this thing as my perspective as a return of the gaze. And then this is followed by a brief overview of radical conservatism, although maybe I'm not so comfortable with the concept. I'll be like sort of switching away maybe from this concept towards alt-right or new right ideas. And then I'll look at the imagination of the West as fantasy and the West as enemy. So these are associated with, respectively, with the pro-regime and the anti-regime folks in China. And especially I want to look at the role of gender and masculinity in this. And if I have time, I'll talk a little about the popular geopolitical theory known as 入关 or cross the Shanghai Pass, but I'm not sure whether I have time for that. So coming from an international relations background, I think that in critical anti-Eurocentric international relations, there has been a lot of work on deconstructing Western imaginations, representations, constructions of the so-called non-West. So there is a booming literature on that, following the tradition of Orientalism, of course. But the focus on non-Western traditions and perspectives often end up reifying the dichotomy of the West versus non-West, reinforcing cultural essentialism and downplaying interconnectedness. The relationship between the West and the non-West in this particular anti-Eurocentric literature is sometimes simplified as one of domination and resistance. And also, as I said, because the focus is very much on Western imaginations of the non-West, thereby constructing the non-West, rarely the processes the other way around are examined. And through this project, what I want to illustrate is how Orientalism and Occidentalism are complementary,
Cette conversation va être enregistrée.
By Occidentalism, I'm using this definition from Ahiska. It refers to a field of social imagination through which those in power consume and reproduce the projection of the West to negotiate and consolidate their hegemony in line with their pragmatic interests. Even though this definition is sort of focused on those in power, but as my research shows, lots of this work of imagination and discursive construction is from sort of bottom-up perspectives. It's not necessarily produced by those in power, and it's sort of always sits at the interface between those in power and between those who govern and those who are being governed. So in the end, this hopes to shed light on the co-constitution of what we might consider world political binaries, such as the dichotomy between the West versus non-West, the liberal versus the authoritarian, the civilized versus the barbarian, and so on and so forth. So a little bit on radical conservatism, but as I said earlier, I'm not very, very sure that I'm going to use this. But there is an increasing interest in the relationship between radical conservatism and the international. But as far as this concept goes, I think it's specifically linked to the German conservative revolution before the Second World War. And what I have in mind here is broader than that. And these diverse trends are sometimes labeled as the new right, the alt-right, the new reactionary movement, and so on. So it's not exactly, these are quite under-conceptualized, in that it's not exactly clear what they mean, but they're more sort of united by what they oppose, such as egalitarianism, feminism, multiculturalism, universalism, progress, and so on. But there are great diversities within this, right? For example, the far right in the in Northern Europe would be pro-gender equality as a kind of boundary marker, sort of boundary marker that defines their identity, national identity against immigrants, whereas the far right in Central and Eastern Europe would be more conservative in terms of gender values. And right-wing nationalists in China endorsing globalization and ideas of progress instead of being against them. But without going into a lengthy conceptual debate about all these diversities, I'm particularly interested in the international or global imaginary in these ideas and movements. So this is about their attitudes towards the so-called liberal international order. I think relevant here are two perspectives. One is the Schmitten perspective that's critical of universal moral principles in liberal internationalism. And in the Chinese context, this is used by some pro-statist intellectuals such as Jiang Shigong, and the clash of civilizations perspective that sees these processes, these challenges as ideological and racial civilizational competitions. And this is adopted by both pro and anti-regime actors in the Chinese context. So I use this little diagram to show you the ways in which the othering of China, so to speak, in rightist movements in the West and the othering of the West in China mirror each other. And all these categories are in quotation marks. So China could be a fantasy for those on the right who love law and order and to some degree authoritarianism as an emphasis on law and order, the authoritarian values instead of authoritarian regimes. And these people could be endorse authoritarian values without supporting certain authoritarian regimes, because these regimes could be geopolitical rivalries. So Nick Land is this leading figure of the so-called Dark Enlightenment or New Reactionary movement. I won't pretend that I'm very familiar with this philosophy, but what's interesting is how some Chinese cities, but also East Asian cities in general, are fantasized as a sort of technological futuristic utopia to him. And somewhat similarly, a spokesperson on international development from the AfD of Germany once said that learning from China is about learning to win, and that Germany's aid policy in Africa shouldn't be led or distracted by political correctness, quote unquote. This is, of course, a view shared by nationalists in China, those in the upper right corner, which I've written about and will talk a little bit more in a minute. Meanwhile, the China's enemy, hawkish people in the US and the US as fantasy people in China, these are the liberal intellectuals, can be very good friends united by their common enemy, which is the Communist Party of China. So the West's fantasy bit these are those who are known as liberal intellectuals. And Yao Lin has conceptualized this as a sort of beaconism. So he's written about the so-called Trumpist turn of Chinese liberal intellectuals. And here we see Occidentalism as a beaconism. It's about sanitizing and glorifying the West, especially the United States, as a beacon of civilization. But what's not so clear in Lin's interpretation, I think, is how this is a particular vision of liberal democracy associated with whiteness and Christianity. And the typical arguments are that the decline is due to how liberal democracy is threatened by heterogeneity, especially Muslims, immigrants, multiculturalism, but also social justice movements. So many US-based dissidents Chinese dissidents are very hostile to, for example, the Me Too movements, the Black Lives Matter movements, and so on. Those who are based in China, so these are political theorists, legal theorists based in China, so they won't be possibly very critical of the Communist Party, but they do share the view that Trumpism is something to be endorsed to some degree, because they also see immigrants as what threatens democracy. And this democracy is, as I said, is associated with a purified understanding of the racial and religious foundations of these regimes. I think I want to point out that there is a sort of tendency to be to use an exceptionalist lens to analyze the Chinese case. So some would say the preference for libertarianism, so critique of the welfare state or whatever, is partly explained by the traumatizing experiences with Maoist socialism many of these people experienced. And this is common to immigrants from communist or post-communist regimes. So they tend to be conservative in terms of economic policies. But it would be inadequate to say that this is something very unique, or Chinese liberals are not real liberals, something like that, because it fails to recognize the connection between liberalism and the new right. Because after all, liberalism went hand in hand with imperialism and colonialism in history. And there were always those particular ideas about progress, about civilizational hierarchy, about modernity inherent to those ideas. And those ideas have been at the beginning of the genesis of the liberal discourse or thoughts in post-socialist China. So you see this famous 1988 documentary called River Elegy that's sort of considered part of the Enlightenment movement in the 80s. So it was made by CCTV actually, but it was very critical of the Chinese regime. But it also used this colonial framework of civilizational hierarchy and civilizing mission. So somehow the land-based civilization in China is inferior to the ocean-based civilization of the Europeans, something like that. I don't think I have much time here, so I'll just quickly talk about the gender aspect in the nationalist discourse. So previously, those were regime critical people, and here we are looking at regime supportive people. the have in common the resentment towards the so-called white left or sort of liberal elites, what they consider liberal elites in the West. That is, they are united by their rejection of progressive social movements, feminism, political correctness, and so on. But they are also similar in the sense that they both reaffirm a Eurocentric racial civilizational hierarchy, but the regime critical folks want the still inferior China to become exactly like an idealized, purified, white Christian white West. And the pro-regime nationalists believe that China is already a better version of the West in terms of technological, economic development, and some particular understandings of this still Eurocentric modernity. So for more on this side, because I've published on this side of things, if you want to know more about this, I wrote about this in this 2020 paper. But here, I think what I want to highlight is the gender aspect in these alt-right discourses in China and elsewhere. So there are two layers to this. First is that the rise of progressive movements and values is seen as a crisis of masculinity. So that's sort of on the domestic level. And on the international level, this is used to construct US-China and US-Russian rivalries. So in these narratives, China and Russia are seen as being able to resist the crisis of masculinity, whereas the US and other liberal democracies in the West are becoming effeminate, are becoming too weak, and therefore unable to compete with China or Russia. So in the Chinese context, you see this feminization of the idea of the white left or liberal elites, which is very similar to what's happening, to how this is framed in alt-right discourses elsewhere. And they all endorse hyper-masculine notions of what a nation should look like. So in the words of Qin Vao, these emphasize practices toward authority control, competitive individualism, independence, aggressiveness, and the capacity for violence. So again, another example from Germany, where it's been argued that Germans have been forgetful about the importance of the military, the police, warrior virtues, and so on. And this, again, is a view shared by many, shared by alt-right communities on Chinese cyberspace, as well. And as for how this is used to construct the rivalries, you can see these two examples from Owens, and conservative influencer from the US, and Ted Cruz, a senator from the US. The video went viral a few days ago on Twitter. It shows like the advertisement of Russian army that's sort of similar to that advertisement of Chinese army as well, versus the US army. And then again, the military is seen as emasculated because the advert of the US army was sort of emphasizing on certain gender equality values. And Owens here said that no society can survive without strongmen, and the East knows this. And I can only imagine what the Russians and the Chinese are thinking. Okay, so let me stop here.
Okay, thank you, Chen Chen.
Yeah.
Many thanks.
I think I've taken too much time.
A a few minutes more. Frederick, if you have your comment, maybe now to move on.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Right. Ooh, but my video seems to be not wanting. Well, thank you, Chen. I was happy to hear that the paper has further evolved, and that because I remember the working paper that you wrote a few years back, which you referenced. Listening to you and reading the contributions, I had 4 questions I wanted to put to you. First was on the general broader framework, which was about this very interesting notion of Eurocentric bias in anti-Eurocentric IR. You highlight the fact that indeed, traditionally, a lot of anti-Eurocentric IR is either developed by European or Western scholars or developed in Western institutions. I wanted to ask you whether this idea of, or this reflection on the existence of Eurocentric bias in anti-Eurocentric IR, whether one cannot also link it to an older genealogy of thought in IR and in whatever one wants to call what was reflection on international relations before the 20th century, and ask how you see current thinking in East Asia and specifically in China about international relations and about the role of the West therein, linked to earlier generation 19th century reflections in East Asia, Japan, Korea, China, about the role of East Asia, and where very much the thinking was of scholars, not of opposing simply West and East, and not so much of domination of East and West, but how to reassert the East by learning from the West. So I know that that is a simplistic representation of these earlier generations of thought, but as you re-explore the relationship between Eurocentric Western scholarship and thought and the scholarship emerging in East Asia, or the thinking, both popular, bottom-up, and intellectual, how do you see the current dialectic between East and West evolve compared to an earlier generation of dialectic in the 19th century? My second question is about the opposition, which I understand is a categorization, a heuristic characterization between the West and China as a fantasy and the West and China as an enemy. Here I wanted to maybe challenge you a bit on the notion of fantasy, because as I understood it, it is a fantasized enemy as much as it is a fantasized utopia, a fantasized example. I was wondering whether the word fantasy, because both are fantasized, both are constructed. So I was wondering whether one pendant, one side, whether China or European described as fantasy, is this an aspirational image? Is it a utopian image? Is it a, both are fantasies, but one is an enemy fantasy. What is the nature of, what is the positive side of the fantasy, I would say? Another word, or maybe challenge you on thinking of that fantasy. The gendered dimension, my third question is on the gendered component of your presentation. You highlight early on that gender is one of the concepts, whether it is gender itself, whether it is gender activism, whether it is notions of political correctness and gender, whether it's feminism, are all constitutive parts of the identity, if I may use that word, of this new global right. Now, later in the presentation, you highlight how specifically feminization is presented in a negative light. Feminization is seen as either a symptom or a cause of weakness, of decline. Now, my question here is, how much is the negativity bound to the feminine, bound to feminization, a byproduct of this new generation of right-wing thought that has this anti-gender, anti-feminism, anti-woman component? Or does this discourse on feminization and negativity of the feminine tie into deeper rooted discourses in East Asia surrounding the role of women's, maybe more traditional values about the role of women and women in the public space? So the question is here, how much is this new hostility to the feminine and the use of the feminine as a symbol of weakness and decline tied into older genealogies of the negative and the positive and the role of the feminine in East Asian societies? Or is it very much a product of this newer generation of right-wing thought? My final question is maybe about the format. At the end of your presentation, you highlighted the role of, you illustrated your presentation with a few tweets, and you highlighted some of the discourse analysis you've done from online discourse. The online spaces where these discourses are made, are there common right-wing online discourses where the fantasized right wing of the West speaks to the fantasized right wing of the East, if I may take that simplification? Are there common right wing spaces where the commonalities are explored and discussed, or are the spaces completely separate from each other through language, through platform, through websites? And does the other side only know the right-wing West and right-wing East, if I may again simplify, know each other only through the imagined fantasy of the utopia or the enemy? So basically, has the online space created a common space for what you see as a commonality in terms of values and discourses of an emerging right wing? And I'll keep it at there to not take up too much time.
Thank you, Frederick. That's a lot of questions, and very big questions as well. Let me start. Yeah, let me just go the order of the questions. The first one is a big question, and I think it's very important to think about the engagement of East Asian intellectuals with the international system, of their understanding of the international system in the 19th century, and the connection between this and what I consider to be a sort of Eurocentric bias in anti-Eurocentric IR is that history is actually not visible or not given enough attention in the discipline. It's being studied a lot in history, in area studies to some degree, but not in international relations enough. So I can hear some echoing sound. I hope it's fine. So that said, this scholarship is very much focused on how the West is imagining and constructing the Orient, the East, right? And it doesn't pay enough attention to how, in particular conjunctures, such as the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, East Asian intellectuals are looking at this international system and not thinking so much of a resistance, but thinking of how to be incorporated in the system. So in the end, this system is co-produced by both sides. And the episode you mentioned about the 19th century intellectuals is a good example to show that this needs to be looked at in more depth in international relations. And the second question is about fantasy. I agree that this is not very well conceptualized at this stage. And I also agree that every enemy is being fantasized to some extent. So always sort of almost idealize the enemy to some extent all the time, so that it could be presented as a legitimate, strong, powerful enemy to be feared. In this particular case, I think I'm talking about, when I talk about the West as fantasy, for example, from the Chinese side, it's a lot to do with this idea of the US as a civilizational beacon, for example, and denial of any inequalities, any injustice, any structural racism, for example, within those systems. So in that sense, it's kind of utopian. And the fantasy guys and the enemy guys are not the same. But again, for the nationalists, it's more complicated. So for the beaconists, who really see the US as an utopian, but for the nationalists, it's more like fantasized enemy. On the one hand, it's the enemy, but on the other hand, there are lots of things about them are very good, we should learn from, but still we are doing better than them, and we're in a competition with them. So yeah, I should be more specific about what I mean by these oppositions. So the gender dimension, I think it's both, at least in East Asia. So on the one hand, there's influence from these globally circulating ideas about certain progressive values, certain social movements represent weakness and femininity and so on. So these are sort of new and imported to some degree from the transnational sphere. And some of it, of course, also is rooted in patriarchal values native to East Asia. So I don't think it's easy to separate the two. Both of them play a part in this. And finally, on the question of whether these speak to each other, I think by and large, it's a one-way communication. So mostly one-way communication in that. So these quite well-educated Chinese internet users, they do a lot of translation work. So they are very aware of what's going on in the West. So all these social movements and so on. So one example is these emerging cartoonists. I don't know if you've seen their work. So they make very impressive artwork that deals with social problems such as race issues, gender issues, and so on. In the COVID also in the US. So it shows that they really know what's going on there, but I don't think the other way, the communications, the other way actually work because of language barrier. So I don't think most of the members of the alt-right communities in the US would be interested in, translating Chinese stuff into English. But there is some exception. For example, Fox News and Global Times, I think they are quite obsessed with each other. So they make reference to each other from time to time. So they're almost like the mirror image of each other. So yeah, I think that's about it. What I have to say. Thanks everyone for attention.
Thank you very much, Chen, for your comments and answer to the question of Frederick. Because of the schedule, we will move very quickly to the next presentation, who is by Ida Lung from the KU Leuven. Ida, you have the floor.
Yeah, thank you. I'll first share my screen.
Great.
Is the screen here? Like,
yeah.
Right. So thanks for having me. For the time being, I guess I will go straight into the topic. I'm very glad to be here, and today I would like to talk about inverting discourse, Hong Kong youth identity negotiation through protest slogans. I think the Hong Kong perspective of understanding the Hong Kong case would be very relevant and very interesting to see, because as the discussion of yesterday went, it was pretty much it's also pretty frequent mentioned that the Hong Kong protest in 2019 actually serves like a watershed moment, that how we understand the communication and the resistance and the civil society in Hong Kong after 2019 would be quite fundamentally different from how we did before. And today I would like to talk about my motivation, like context, framework, research questions, very briefly on empirical patterns because of the very tight time budget, and also some part of takeaways. So first of all, I started asking this question. So the social movements, the protests in 2019 in Hong Kong has been very famous for being a leaderless movement while mobilizing a lot of people. So the question I'm asking is that how do people communicate as a collective under the leaderless movements? How do they actually communicate themselves as a collective group and a community? And to narrow down, I would like to ask a second question. What kind of tools do they communicate through? And I think here I would use as an everyday life language in a cyberspace particularly. And so the second question would be, how do people actually construct their boundaries through a shared cyberspace? Here I would like to highlight that it's a shared cyberspace. So it's actually also shared with those affiliated, feeling more affiliated with the Chinese identity. So it's not only their own political stance, but how do they act, differentiate other people within a co-shared cyberspace with different political stance. And the third question is, how do these questions inform and tell us about the linkage about space and language and authoritarian resistance? So first off, how I understand the issue is from a theoretical framework of seeing orthography as a social action. Orthography means basically how we put our daily life language into a written form, but here it's not so much of a linguistic sense. But how I understand it is that from a more anthropologist way of seeing it is that deviating from orthography creates some space for creating social meaning. And therefore, when we look at the deviation of orthographies, we're actually seeing it as a zone of social meaning. And within these zones of social meaning, how do the bottom-up discourse from the youth, from the protesters, and the top-down discourses from the government interact with each other, and hereby therefore it's why strategies and resistance come into play. How in deviated orthographies in cyberspace actually invert the power structures of discourse, shaping and reshaping agenda setting and counteractions. And it would be very interesting, especially more interesting considering the Hong Kong case, because in the literature, how we understand the authoritarian regimes, which is China's reaction towards the Hong Kong social movement, is very interesting. The very fact that Hong Kong is increasingly authoritarian, but at the same time, Hong Kong manages to allow this social movement to take place. Some scholars will think that it is exactly because China opted for a way to neither concede nor to oppress, nor to suppress the movement. But how they actually interact or how they actually exert their dominance, their power, it's by counter-framing, counter-mobilization, with a mixture of tolerance and a threat of violence. So in this very sense, if we understand it in this way, the counter-framing, the counter-mobilization could arguably be actually the frontier of how we fight against the authoritarian control. So it could be a frontier of resistance. So before I talk about the empirical patterns, I'd like to talk about contextualizing Cantonese as a resistance. Why is using Cantonese itself as a basis of communication itself a resistance? There are literature talking about the linkage between the linguistics and identity of Hong Kong. Cantonese, despite being the majority the mother tongue of majority, has been increasingly being marginalized. For example, more and more high-level jobs would prefer Mandarin. Public schools in Hong Kong would actually teach Chinese in Mandarin instead of their own mother tongue Cantonese. And you can see that in this atmosphere and this social vibes, it's actually Cantonese is becoming a language of minority. society. It's becoming threatened and marginalized. And that literature has been discussing that Cantonese Mandarin has been serving like an imagined linguistic border in response to the eroding autonomy. So basically, it is exactly because the autonomy of Hong Kong has been declining that the Cantonese Mandarin linguistic border has become more and more important and powerful. And while Mandarin can also be seen as a bridge towards the Chinese identity. And therefore, the very choice of Cantonese as the basis of a communication code could be seen as an empowerment that the bottom up community are using Cantonese as a way of shaping their discourses. They are taking the initiative, and that they are very empowered in using this very language. And it's also very strong signs of resistance in a sense that they are using it and keeping it alive and keeping it in a dominant role in forming their resistance. And the second perspective of contextualizing Cantonese as a resistance is about the leaderless mobilization. So because the movement is leaderless, that there is a very urgent need of a bottom-up shared communication, while they would also have to avoid infiltration of information towards the more Chinese affiliated group. And therefore, the way they communicate basing themselves on Cantonese also serve as an identity differentiating mechanism and a platform of identity negotiation. Here, I would like to jump into some concrete examples, which is part of the many examples. On this slide, you can see particularly the first one. It was these words, picnic, observing stars, have been used on 11th of June 2019. So one night before 2 million people were mobilized. They were using these very apolitical way to describe protests. When they mobilize, they don't say, we go protesting. They would say, let's go picnic or let's go see the stars. So it's basically, it's a way to keep the more Chinese affiliated community not aware that it is a protest. And it's, of course, at the meanwhile, also a way to escape from the legal consequences of mobilizing people. And another example is that the protest has been famous for their tactics of being bee water, but actually the first emergence of bee water comes from a police force, which accused a protester by attacking them through bottles of water. So what the protesters do is that they invert the power structures of the top-down discourse from the police force, and they change the meaning of bee water. So since they changed the meaning, bee water actually means to avoid the police. So by changing the meaning, they actually changed their discourse and narrative from the police force to theirs. So here is a very concrete shift of power structure, which is similar to the next example of We Connect. We Connect, it's basically a slogan from the electoral campaign of Carrie Lam, the chief executive, which the protesters changed the meaning later on to say that they connect with some ethnic minorities in Hong Kong to try to mobilize the largest crowd as possible. And upcoming is some examples that are more Cantonese based. For example, the first day, the 9th of June, where 1 million were mobilized. The slogan that they use is to say anti-extradition to China. In Cantonese, it's is the same pronunciation of saying don't push us to death. It's a very linguistic embedded analogy, but here they share a similar quote, and you can see only people that are really, really familiar with Cantonese would get this embedded meaning and analogy of the slogans. The following two are also examples that are from the words from the discourse of the police force, but they are actually having a double meaning in Cantonese, and that they change the meaning and then they serve it as a name of their own identity communities. And for the time being, I will skip the explanation, but I would definitely welcome questions and we can go back to it if needed. So from these examples of communication codes, which could be based on the top-down discourses of the powerful, which could also be based on apolitical descriptions of political scenarios, and also based on Cantonese. These, I would argue that they are actually making space, making their own communication codes in the cyberspace that could serve as a feasible resistance in the authoritarian context. One of the importance of this way of communicating is that by deviating from the formal writing system, by having some deviated orthographies, they not only avoid the censorship, but also avoid the counter actions. They buy some time for the protesters that, for example, the police force would not understand immediately of the newly emerged terms, and therefore the police could not mobilize the police force timely, and thus the protesters which are being mobilized, they would not face the police as fast as using the formal writing system. But it was not meant to be. But then later on, these words, these communication codes, also evolved as a co-constructed identity. So it basically serves as like a differentiating mechanism. If you can understand the cultural codes, the communication codes, you are either very close to this, you're following very close to the political dynamics, or you're very familiar to the Cantonese. And this way, they form a mechanism of shaping who is in our group and who is not. And therefore, it is also a space making for discourse for youths who would otherwise do not have the ability to invert the power structures and make the discourse and influence the agenda setting of the protests. And therefore, it is also about making space for the discourse and changing their power structures. So in a very brief, in a very professional and overbrief way of saying it is that to answer the questions is that how do people communicate as a collective under leaderless movement is that they actually share their common codes, and they construct their space of negotiating the discourses. They would invert the power structures, change the meaning, and use as their mobilizing codes. And the second question is that how do they actually construct boundaries? It's based on deviated orthographies, and that will later on evolve into some identity differentiating mechanisms. And what is relevant to these, to the thesis, to the topic of this conference is that I think in this case study, I have tried to engage the lenses of time and space into languages. For example, to think of when this new linguistic term is being termed, and what kind of actual consequences were translated from cyberspace to everyday life. For example, after they said we would have a picnic, we would have observing the stars, and on the next day, 2 million people were being mobilized. So engaging the lenses of materiality, time and space into languages, we can actually see that when the languages are being deviated from their conventional way of writing, a new space of interpreting, a new space of resistance is being created. And I hope you would also find this case study interesting and relevant to the topic. And thanks for your attention.
Many thanks, Ida, for your very inspiring presentation. I'm sure there is plenty of questions. Because we are running out of time, I will invite Jeffrey. Jeffrey, if you're here, you have the floor.
All right. Hello, everybody. Thank you for this opportunity. I'm going to share my screen now since we are having not so much time. So let me just get right to it. Okay, can you see this?
Yeah.
All right, great. So my topic today is social media, new religious movements, and Japan's GENEsYs movement. And I'm Jeffrey Hall, by the way. I'm a lecturer at Honda University of International Studies, and until recently I was at Waseda University. Okay, here we go. So in November 2020, as you probably all know, unless you've been living in a cave, many supporters of Donald Trump refused to accept the legitimacy of Joe Biden's victory, clinging to various conspiracy theories about election fraud. And some of these conspiracy theories involved the belief that the Chinese government was, backing Biden, interfering with the American election. And some Japanese social media users began sharing Japanese translations of a selective few of these theories, and they became known as the GENEsYs movement by Japanese netizens. and several demonstrations involving hundreds of people were held in Tokyo and Fukuoka between November 2020 and January 2021. This presentation is a very preliminary look at my research on the topic, which was conducted through in-person, non-participant observation of several of these marches, and also ethnographic online ethnography of GENEsYs social media communities on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. These are some photos here that I took at a rally in November. Here's some other examples here. You'll note that this is not really a spontaneous leaderless movement like the previous presentation. These are people carrying flags and professionally printed banners that were distributed to everyone before the march, except for a few exceptions like this one on the right, where they actually have some homemade signs about, freeing activists in Hong Kong or China being GENESYs. This is all very much focused on China in their marches. Here's another example that's slightly interesting. This is a flyer distributed by organizers at a January 2021 march in Fukuoka. That is not my finger. I took this from social media. I don't have such nice nails, but it has the lyrics of the Japanese national anthem on the left, above a picture of Trump, and then on the right it has a katakana version of the American national anthem. If you can read Japanese, I challenge you to try to sing the song based on these syllables, but at the bottom it also says, the real leader or the real winner of this presidential election is Trump, and you're supposed to chant that in Japanese as you march. So this is a very organized, professional flyer distributed to the people at these marches. This term GENEsYs is very confusing, and it has caused a lot of confusion, especially in international media reports. The Japanese media, such as the Asahi Shimbun, have referred to these protests as GENEsYs, but have also referred to the QAnon supporters as GENEsYs. And this is a very confusing thing because it conflates these two movements. However, from my research, I have not really found very much QAnon believers at these demonstrations or even in their social media postings. So they're not really the same as QAnon. And while they do use similar Twitter tactics and other social media in the way that QAnon followers have used around the world, this is not a QAnon-based movement. This diagram on the right is from an Asahi Shimbun podcast where they talk about how a few Twitter users spread memes and it diffuses to 40,000 or more people from just a few top people. And this is something that happens with these people as well. However, there are other organizations behind this movement, and that is the focus of my research today. This is one person who organized a few of these events. His name is Kobayashi Naota. He's based in Saitama, and he's chairman of this organization, which is basically the supporters, the organization of Trump supporters. And you can see on the left, he's in America at a Trump rally. On the right, he's in the Fukuoka march. He posted this on Facebook. He is here also shown with a group of protesters in front of the US Embassy in March. He's still doing these even in March and in April. And not very many people are on his side there. But what is important here is that he is a member of the Sanctuary Church, which is a American new religious movement that is a splinter group of the Unification Church, Korean Unification Church, known sometimes as the Moonies. And he is a member of this, and he's been organizing these events in Tokyo. But it's not just the Sanctuary Church. There are three major, well, not really major, but three new religious movements that are promoting these events, organizing these events, often not in the name of their organization, but having someone who, if you look up, you do a little digging on them, they turn out to be a member of these religions. But one of them is Happy Science, founded in the 1980s by a Japanese man named Okawa Ryuho. The other is the Sanctuary Church, which, as I said, is a splinter group from the Unification Church, led by one of Reverend Moon's sons, who decided to go out and start his own religion and believe in Pennsylvania or New York. He has lots of guns and he's in the media a lot. And then there's Falun Gong, which I'm sure most of the people listening to this are aware of. And Falun Gong has been active in spreading kind of anti-Chinese messages, anti-Chinese government messages around the world because they're outlawed in China and they've moved to the United States as a base. But they're also active in Japan as well, and they're taking part in these demonstrations. Here's an example of one of these connections here. On January 6th, an earlier event in the day was organized by Mr. Kobayashi of the Sanctuary Church at the US Embassy. Then he scheduled it so that participants would have time to get on a train and then go to Hibiya Park in Tokyo to attend a Support Trump from Japan march, God Bless Trump march. And that was a couple hours later, and he was promoting both events on his social media. At the larger march, there were Falun Gong members standing around passing out lots of literature, newspapers about how the election was stolen and China was behind it and so on. So all these groups are working together in organizing these events. And while those offline events are interesting, what's really more interesting to me and to my research is that it's not that there's a tiny demonstration of 200 or 300 or 400 people in Tokyo, but rather that these groups have used their well-funded online media networks to translate or to interpret American conspiracy theory discourse about the 2020 election into Japanese. And this is something that when I talked to Chen in previous years at these events, her research has talked about how the Chinese nationalists and other groups, they bring over these American conservative ideas, but in Japan, that really wasn't happening until very recently. And these religious groups are a key player in bringing these American sort of populist Trumpist ideas over. So they make these videos very quickly within a day or two of the American events happening. They, in some cases, get huge amounts of views. This video on the right, it's very hard to see, but it has over 300,000 views, and it's by a Happy Science member, Mr. Aiba, and 300,000 is maybe 10 times some estimates of the actual members of Happy Science. So this is getting to far more people than just followers of his religion. And so they bridge this language gap between the American right and Japanese nationalists, but they selectively interpret which theories and which discourses. And these are theories that are anti-Chinese theories, or as Chen was saying, China is the enemy. That is all they really care about here. They don't care about the other theories. They don't care about QAnon or secret underground pedophile things. It's all about China. And so quickly getting to some more points. This is a form of transnational anti-Chinese activism. All three of these groups are deeply involved with conservative political causes, and they're hostile towards the Chinese government. Of course, Falun Gong, we all know, is, yeah, definitely, they've been banned, they're persecuted. But the other two groups also see that China as a threat to world peace, and the Happy Science leader actually believes that we should all invade China and take over China to save the world with America as our friends. But the involvement and influence of these new religious movements is in this kind of activism in Japanese politics is an important topic, and it's new. It's something that's only really taken off since the election. You might see them on the sidelines of Yasukuni Shrine each year passing out literature, but very few people would pay attention. But now, thanks to this online media, thanks to this transnational linkage, they can bring in these American ideas and become popular. So here's some very, very preliminary conclusions. I'll introduce a little light theory here. I'm not really heavy on theory yet, but figures from these transnational new religious movements who often present themselves as typical Japanese conservatives and not members of these religions are acting as socially skilled national identity entrepreneurs. Alexander Book uses this term in his book about the territorial disputes, but the 2020 US election provided an opportunity or a field shift for them to use their transnational ties and financial resources to selectively import conspiracy theory discourse from America, particularly those related to China. And through this well-funded media, they not only influence how Japan's nationalist right views Biden and the Biden administration, but also better position themselves and their religion as influencers on the Japanese right. In addition, Happy Science has founded the Japan Conservative Union, organizing CPAC Japan, a conference that has invited major members of the ruling LDP party in Japan, and also Republicans such as Ted Cruz and other leading kind of Trumpist American Republicans to Japan. So I'm just going to close it here since we're a little low on time, and I know you want to have lunch and perhaps I want to have dinner. But I just want to mention here, though, that this is a youth panel related thing, but it's not really a youth movement. This is something I've struggled with since joining these workshops. This is very much a movement, just like other conservative movements in Japan, where there are more older people than millennials at these, people in their 40s and 50s or even their 60s. There are some young people, there are some, but it's really not the case that they are the primary drivers of this. Also, there's a commonality here between this and the QAnon movement, where in America, you see people storming the Capitol, people holding QAnon events, and they're mostly older. They're not so many younger people. So this is perhaps some interesting thing to be explored more, how these older people become more radicalized and involved in these kind of nationalist causes. Anyway, thank you for listening to my talk, and I look forward to any questions.
Many thanks, Jeffrey. I will give the floor quickly to Frederick for a few comments. Frederick, if you have just a few comments or questions. Frederick, do you hear me?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, okay, it's okay.
Thank you, Ida, and thank you, Jeffrey, for a very interesting set of presentations. I'll keep it short because we're running out of time and I want to give everybody the time to react. Very quickly, a cross question for the two of you, also thinking of Chen's presentation, who has had to leave us and I had to thank everybody in her name. Translation and language seem incredibly important in all of this. Now, obviously, we're in Belgium, so language as a mobilizer and as a political weapon is not something new for us. But I would like to ask the both of you, how much is language in East Asia increasingly becoming not only a tool of nation building, which it definitely was in the 19th century, but increasingly also a political tool for political conflicts within the country, whether it is translation of information or ideas from the outside, or whether it is like Ida Long in reshaping the identities within the countries. Is language being again politicized, which was not something that we saw more recently in East Asian societies. Then specifically for Jeffrey, very tantalizing presentation, obviously only very initial explorations. I'd like to ask you the relationship between the anti-Chinese elements you highlighted and the deeper rooted anti-communist discourses. It's becoming increasingly difficult to disentangle in America, but in Japan as well, what is anti-Chinese and what is rooted in anti-communist traditions. Obviously, the distinction is a bit artificial, but that would be my first question to you. And I'll keep it at that for the moment. Thank you.
Thank you, Frederick.
Maybe Ida, you can go first.
Yeah, sure. So I'll respond to the cross question about translation and language. I think it's very nice how you shape it, like of not only national building but also as a political weapon. And I think it's especially relevant because as you see the geopolitical tension in East Asia, it's very relevant to language. For example, that of Taiwan, Hong Kong, and China, they are all using Chinese, but then a slightly different way of Chinese. And this really creates a lot of interesting phenomena of how language are being politicized. For example, in Hong Kong, one of the examples is just now, like it not only shapes the narrative, but it also paves way for their identity shaping. And it is like whether you know Cantonese, this very criteria becomes identity negotiation and an identity differentiating mechanism. And for Taiwan, I've also seen very online journals that talks about the infiltration of the Chinese from China. For example, there are certain words that you would use more in China, but not too much in Taiwan. But then they have done like a research on their online discourses, and they found that actually a lot of terms from China has been borrowed and very frequently in Taiwan forums, and therefore that also started another debate of whether it's coming back, the Chinese influence, or whether the Taiwanese are actually more vulnerable or more influenced by the Chinese culture, which creates a lot of tension of who is exporting their influence or whether anything has to be done. So I would argue like language per se, especially in the geopolitical tension of China and surrounding areas, is definitely a very interesting and relevant frontier to capture the geopolitical tensions. And I hope this adds a bit of information to your question.
Okay, so I'll answer the questions now. First, I'll start out with the question about language and translation. I guess those of you who have been to Japan probably are aware that Japan is not a very multilingual country. It's not like Belgium, it's not like Hong Kong. So having certain individuals who have these language skills, who travel abroad, who can bring these ideas to Japan, if they have proper funding like Happy Science does, they can immediately just jump in there and get exposure and start influencing people, especially Happy Science sending their people to the American CPAC conference and so on. So this is a very important thing. Also, the case of activists from Hong Kong who can speak Japanese, they get huge exposure in Japan because of this lack of multilingualism. So having people who can speak Japanese, or Japanese who can go abroad and make these connections, these are key bridges in this transnational kind of conservatism or anti-Chinese movement. And very quickly moving on to this very interesting question about anti-Chinese and anti-communism. You're right, Frederick, in pointing out that the distinction is kind of falling apart recently. In the traditional Japanese far right, they very much were focused on communism during the Cold War especially, but now they interchangeably use Chinese communist, Chinese fascist, Chinese Nazi. All these terms are all just generally used together without any real discussion of, what is communism, like what is fascism. But it's a very interesting question to explore more. And as you said, it's very preliminary, and I hope to have more detailed research in the future.
Thank you very much, Jeffrey. Is there any other question, Frederick, or comments? No? I can hear nobody. So if there is no further comments or questions, maybe I can give the floor for the concluding remark to Anne Huayong, our Vice-Rector for International Relations and Development Cooperation. Anne, if you are here.
Yes. So thank you very much, Thierry. I must say that I am very honored, very happy to close this conference about East Asian youth in public spaces. Unfortunately, I was not available to follow the 2 half-day speeches and discussions you had, but I had the opportunity to listen to part of the exchanges of yesterday morning on YouTube, yesterday evening. And I'm very happy also, of course, to have had the opportunity to follow this last panel. And I must say I'm really struck by the richness of the results presented. Now, as you of course know, this conference closes the so-called GENEsYs project on East Asian youth identities and practices in public spaces, which was the first collective project obtained in 2016 by East, right after the creation or the establishment of the research center. And so first of all, I would really like to congratulate very sincerely the GENESYs team, and particularly Vanessa Francheville, of course, the director of EAST, but also Pierre Petit, Thierry Kellner, and Baudouin de Charneux for these 4 years research program. If you did not do so yet, I really warmly invite you to take a look at the GENESYs project website, where you will see all the individual and collective research results produced by the GENESYs team. And among the results of the project, there are these 2 edit volumes. So first one directed by you, Vanessa, and by Gwenaëlle Gaffric, on China's youth cultures and collective spaces, published by Routledge. And a second edited volume is forthcoming, I think, that will be edited by Chen Sang and Frédéric Pugnard. Very interesting also are the short videos. So I had a look also yesterday evening and took a look at all those videos that were published on the website. Very interesting as well. Well, I think that the GENESYs project has very clearly shown how crucial the establishment of EAST is for our university, especially. EAST has constituted a catalyst for and a multiplier of international cooperation, and especially, but not only, but especially with our strategic and privileged partners. It really helped creating an interdisciplinary space, which has allowed establishing bridges and developing synergies between junior researchers. And I think so there were 3 PhDs, not yet defended, but it will come, but also several postdoctoral funding available. So synergies, bridges between junior researchers and more senior academics working on East Asia in various disciplines: political science, philosophy, history, anthropology, etc. So this conference marks and celebrates the end of the GENESYs project, but I've no doubt, and I hope, of course, that the EAST team will invest its dynamism and creativity into other very interesting future research projects. And speaking about the EAST team's creativity, I would like to make the link with the exhibition on East Asian youth in public spaces. So, of course, I warmly invite you to visit this, either virtually or physically, if I may say so, because it exists in both formats. I had the chance to take a look at it virtually, if I may say so, and it gathers really beautiful and quite interesting pictures, which have all been taken by GENESYs project's researchers during their fieldwork. So they really give a concrete vision, or constitute some sort of concretization, I would say, of what your research is about. So for this as well, for this exhibition as well, really my most sincere congratulations, and also for all the rest of the work done, of course. So once again, thank you to the GENESYs team and to all other colleagues from Belgium, but also, of course, from abroad, who collaborated to this GENESYs project and took part in this event. And I think that we will now see a short video presenting the exhibition. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Anne-Huayong. Peter, for finding the time in your very busy schedule. I know it's not easy as the Vice Rector of International Relations and Development Cooperation to find some spots in your schedule. So thank you so much. So we would like now to indeed introduce the exhibition, which you can see if you live in Brussels on Solbosch campus in H building in the main hall, so first floor or ground floor actually, but that you can also check out on our website, as was mentioned. So to introduce the exhibition, we have a short video. It's really short, 3-4 minutes maybe, that will now be screened. So this is the achievement of Van Minh Nguyen and Lisa Richaud's work. Minh is here this morning, so thank you again for all your hard work and what you did with these pictures that were sent to you by various scholars without any clear goal to start with, and then together with Lisa Richaud you managed to produce something that is coherent. You produced a narrative that actually perfectly reflects the research that have been conducted so far by GENEsYs members and associated researchers. So thank you so much. So I think now we can just launch the video. Il n'y a pas de son pour nous, c'est normal. Il n'y a pas de son pour nous. Mais eux entendent le son.
We created the exhibition Asian Youth in Public Spaces, which celebrates the end of a 5-year-long project titled GENEsYs. Despite working on the same overarching themes, that is youth and public spaces in late socialist East and Southeast Asia, GENEsYs contributors engaged in very different research topics.
All the photos in the exhibition were taken by researchers associated with the GENEsYs project. So the challenge for us as we were preparing the exhibition was to create a cohesive narrative out of very heterogeneous material. So for example, what does a beer-drinking punkster have in common with skaters in Hanoi? Or what does a group of university students practicing calligraphy in Beijing have in common with young monks performing traditional dances in rural Laos?
At first glance, these photos do not share much, for each contributor shows us different ways of being young and performing youth in Vietnam, Laos, and China. However, at a deeper analysis, young people in these countries have a lot of surprising similarities, for they use and appropriate public spaces for the same purpose. They want to express themselves despite the social and political constraints of these highly authoritarian regimes.
So in this cluster, which is entitled Aesthetics of Disorder, we put together photos that might disrupt cliches that we could have about Asian youth, and also to show that Asian youth sometimes engage in practices that could also disturb norms of so-called civilized behavior in urban spaces.
The idea behind this cluster, which is titled Placemaking in the City, is how did young people come up with strategies to appropriate public spaces in an urban context characterized by rapid urbanization.
So with this exhibition, we hope that we did justice to the complexities of an overgeneralized category such as that of Asian youth, offering stories of flesh and blood individuals embedded in everyday context and collective spaces.
So welcome everyone to visit the exhibition. Do tell your friends and colleagues and students. The campus is open as usual, and the H building is very accessible, so you can go and check anytime. That's a very unique exhibition, I believe. We hope that in the future it may circulate in other cities and other universities. That's something that we could consider, but for now, it's here on campus, so please go and check and invite others to go and check whenever you come to our campus. So just a concluding word. So it's always strange to conclude a conference where you don't really see people because they're online. But I have a few people in front of me, though, so that gives me the illusion that the room is full somehow, and that I'm talking to everyone, both online and offline. So thank you so much for being here today. I also want to thank Françoise Loat, who is here, because she was also one of the founders of the GENEsYs project, even though along the way she retired, so lucky. But she was there from the beginning, and she is now she's here with us for the concluding events of GENEsYs. That's the end of a 5-year project, but at the same time, it's the beginning of new adventures for East. Each and all of us have new projects on the way, and you will hear from us for sure very soon on various different projects. So I want to thank the whole East team, the GENEsYs team, of course, and also everyone who has contributed to the GENEsYs project, because we also had collaborations with several colleagues from all across the world. And that's exactly, we have achieved exactly what we wanted to achieve, meaning that it's not just about producing books or releasing special issues, or it's also about creating an atmosphere and a stimulating environment for young scholars, like you mentioned, and to work more on East Asia and to create, to be creative in general. So I think the photo exhibition is one proof that this is possible, that this can go even beyond academic outcome. So I think we have, all in all, achieved even more than what we thought we could achieve. So I'm really proud of this project. I think we should all be. And again, this is just a new beginning from now. I don't want to see this as an end. And I invite everyone to go and check our website. There are contacts of all members for those of you online who want to know more about the project and who want to maybe ask questions or dig in these topics that we have explored. Do not hesitate to contact any of us. The website is not going to change much from now because it's all there. But we are still available, and we are still happy to answer questions, maybe have opportunities to circulate with the exhibition or to present or work finding in other universities. So thank you so much, and I think this is the end of the event. So thank you for following us, and we hope to seeing you physically, hopefully, or online very soon. Thank you.
Thank you.